Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where quiet curiosity settles in for the evening and science is allowed to speak in a softer voice. Tonight, we are slipping beneath the surface and into a world that never really tucks itself in the way we do. On land, sleep feels familiar. You get comfortable, you close your eyes, you drift off, and for a while the day stops asking anything of you. But in the sea, that simple pattern starts to fall apart very quickly. There are creatures that rest while drifting, creatures that keep moving while half of the brain slows down, creatures that hide in cracks, bury themselves in sand, float in place, or seem to ignore the whole business entirely. It turns out that once you live underwater, sleep stops looking like a bed, a blanket, and a dark room, and starts looking more like a survival strategy with 1,000 different disguises. Before we settle into all of that, take a second and notice where you are right now. Are you listening from a city apartment with a little traffic outside, from a quiet house, from bed, from a train, from somewhere in the middle of a late evening that has stretched longer than you planned? And what time is it where you are? There is something fitting about asking that before talking about the sea, because the ocean keeps its own schedule. Near the surface there is dawn and dusk, moonlight and shade, tides and shifting brightness. Far below there are places where sunlight never arrives at all, and yet life still follows patterns, pauses and routines that are very much alive, even if they do not resemble ours. And if this sounds like the kind of thing you enjoy unwinding to, you know what to do. A like, a subscription, any small sign that this calm little corner reached you tonight, it really does help. It lets more people find these slow journeys through strange parts of the world, especially the ones that are best explored when the day is finally done and the mind is ready to loosen its grip a little. Now, as for the question itself, why ocean creatures do not sleep like we do? The short answer would be that water changes everything. That would be true, but not very satisfying. So let's take the longer route, because the longer route is usually where the interesting details are. Once you move life into the ocean, you change the rules of breathing, movement, hiding, hunting, warming up, cooling down, seeing, hearing, and staying alive long enough to do any of those things again tomorrow. Sleep, or whatever stands in for sleep, has to fit inside all of that. For humans, sleep is a fairly bold act. We lie down, become much less aware, and trust that the room, the house, and ideally the rest of the neighbourhood will behave themselves for a few hours. We can do that because our bodies are built for it, and because over time we have created safe places to make that possible. Doors lock, walls block wind, beds support weight, blankets trap heat. Even in the wild past of our species, sleep usually happened in some kind of shelter, some kind of group, some kind of arrangement where total exposure was at least reduced a little. A fish does not get that option in the same way. Neither does a whale, a sea turtle, an octopus, a parrotfish, or a shark. The ocean has no bedrooms. It has ledges, coral branches, seagrass, open water, rock crevices, muddy bottoms, kelp forests, caves, underhangs, and endless moving water. Even at its calmest, it is still in motion. Even when it looks empty, it is full of mouths. If a creature in that world is going to rest, it has to do it while accounting for currents, predators, oxygen, buoyancy, pressure, visibility, and in many cases the constant need not to sink, not to float too high, and not to become an easy meal. That alone already tells you why ocean sleep cannot be a simple copy of land sleep. The setting is different, the problems are different, and the bodies are different. A dolphin cannot flop down and go fully unconscious at the surface for 8 hours. It has to breathe air on purpose. That one detail changes everything. A reef of fish cannot always disappear into total stillness in bright open water and expect to be there in the morning. A shark that relies on steady movement to keep water flowing over its gills may not be able to stop in the way a lizard under a warm rock can stop. A tuna built for constant cruising is not living the same life as a cat curled on a windowsill, and so its version of rest is never going to look like yours. One of the first mistakes we tend to make is assuming that sleep has to look familiar before it counts. We imagine eyelids, stillness, limp muscles, deep breathing, and a clear switch between awake and asleep. But that is just the human model, and even on land that model does not cover everyone. Birds do strange things. Reptiles do different strange things. Insects complicate the picture. Then the ocean arrives and politely destroys any remaining confidence we had in the idea that rest must come in one standard format. In some marine animals, the signs are subtle. Activity drops. Responsiveness changes. The body takes on a different posture. The animal chooses a safer place. There may be periods of reduced movement, altered brain activity, or lowered reaction to the outside world, but not necessarily complete shutdown. In others, it becomes even harder to pin down. They may keep swimming, they may hover, they may pulse slowly, they may continue performing the minimum needed to stay alive while reducing everything else. From the outside, it can look less like sleep and more like a negotiated truce with exhaustion. That really is one of the useful ways to think about it. Ocean creatures are not failing to sleep properly. They are solving the problem differently. We are the ones carrying around a land-based expectation and trying to make the rest of life fit it. But the sea is not especially interested in making anything convenient for us. It does not care that we like mattresses, darkness, and a full night off. It says more or less, here is salt water, limited visibility, variable temperature, pressure, and constant movement. Good luck finding a rest schedule that does not get you eaten. Consider for a moment what it would mean to sleep in open water if you were a small fish. You're not standing on anything. You're not hiding under a blanket. You're suspended in a volume of space that is moving around you. There may be a larger fish nearby that considers you an excellent late-night snack. There may be changing light from the moon above, drifting shadows, plankton in the water, and a current that wants to nudge you somewhere unhelpful. If you become deeply unresponsive, that is a risk. If you stay too alert, you never recover. So your body finds a compromise. Maybe you settle into a reef crevice where your body just fits. Maybe your colours change at night. Maybe your metabolism eases down. Maybe you remain capable of sudden action while still getting some degree of restoration. That may not look restful to us, but from an evolutionary point of view, it is brilliant. It does enough without demanding the impossible. The same logic applies again and again across marine life. Rest is not just about recovery. It is about recovery under constraint. A whale has to surface for air. A fish may have to keep water moving over its gills. A jellyfish has no brain in the human sense, so asking whether it sleeps like we do is already the wrong frame. A sea otter, admittedly much more familiar to us because it is a mammal, and frankly, a bit of an overachiever in the charm department, can float on its back and wrap itself in kelp to keep from drifting away. That is closer to our idea of bedtime, but only because we are spotting the parts we recognise and ignoring the fact that the bed is cold ocean water and the blanket is seaweed. The sea also adds another complication that humans rarely have to think about in bed, which is that breathing and resting are not always separate tasks. We breathe automatically. We can be deeply asleep and the body keeps handling the basics. Many marine animals do not have that luxury in the same way. Dolphins and some other marine mammals must consciously come up for air. That means their brains cannot switch off entirely the way ours can. They have to stay partly available to the job. There is no equivalent of rolling over and trusting the body to handle everything until morning. If they rested that way, morning might become a very theoretical concept. And then there is the question of light. On land, most of us are used to thinking in days and nights shaped by sunrise, sunset, work hours, lamps and screens. In the ocean, light behaves differently and disappears quickly with depth. Red light vanishes first, then orange, yellow, green, until deeper waters are left in blue and then darkness. In shallow reefs, day-night patterns are obvious. In the deep ocean, there is no sunrise to paint the room until everyone breakfast is starting. Yet animals still have rhythms. Some follow food movement. Some follow vertical migrations of prey. Some respond to faint changes in light near the surface. Others follow internal clocks that evolved under conditions very unlike ours. Rest in the sea is tied not just to darkness, but to depth, tide, temperature, danger, and feeding opportunity. That matters because sleep is never just about being tired. It is about timing. Humans do not usually decide to sleep only after calculating predator density, oxygen flow, water column position, and whether the moonlight is exposing their outline to something with teeth. Ocean animals often do, not with conscious little checklists obviously, but through bodies shaped over millions of years to respond at the right moment in the right place. A fish may retreat into coral when the light fades. A turtle may wedge itself under a ledge. Some species become pale or darker at night. Others reduce movement in predictable cycles. Some hunt at night and rest by day. Some do the reverse. Some seem to take very short, cautious periods of lowered activity rather than one long uninterrupted stretch. And because the ocean is so varied, we should be careful not to talk about ocean creatures as though they all face the same conditions. A reef fish lives in a crowded city full of hiding places, neighbours, and constant visual information. A deep-sea squid lives in a very different universe. A seal dividing time between land and sea has one set of options. A shark crossing open water has another. An octopus with a soft body, no bones, and a talent for turning itself into an irritated piece of furniture has yet another. The answer to why they do not sleep like we do is never going to be one sentence, because the ocean itself is not one environment. It is a stack of worlds. That is what makes this topic so good for a slow look. At first it sounds like a simple curiosity. Do fish sleep? Do whales sleep? Do sharks sleep? But under those questions sits something larger and much more interesting. What does sleep become when the world around you makes ordinary sleep difficult, dangerous, or impossible? How much rest is enough? What parts of the brain need to go quiet? What parts must stay alert? What behaviour counts as sleep if the animal does not have eyelids, does not lie down, does not stop moving, or does not even have a brain organised remotely like ours? There is also a nice bit of humility in all of this. Humans are very good at taking our own setup and treating it like the main version. We sleep lying down, so lying down starts to feel important. We close our eyes, so eyelids start to seem essential. We lose awareness for long chunks, so uninterrupted unconsciousness starts to look like the gold standard. Then you meet a dolphin that sleeps with half its brain at a time, or a fish that settles into a crevice and changes colour, or a jellyfish that appears to enter a rest state without owning anything we would confidently call a mind. And suddenly, the categories begin to wobble. That wobble is useful. Science often gets more interesting at exactly the point where a familiar word stops behaving. Sleep is one of those words. You think you know what it means until you try applying it across the tree of life. Then the neat edges dissolve. Is sleep defined by posture? No. By closed eyes? No. By immobility? Also no. By reduced responsiveness? Sometimes by brain waves matching human sleep stages. Helpful in some animals, less useful in others. By a rebound effect after deprivation, where the animal seems to make up for lost rest later. That turns out to be one of the stronger clues, because it suggests the rest period is biologically necessary, not just inactivity caused by boredom or bad weather. And once scientists began looking more carefully, the ocean started offering examples that were at once strange and very practical. Some fish settle down so deeply at night that they can be gently handled without responding much. Others secrete mucus cocoons, not because they are trying to create spa conditions, but because those cocoons may help mask scent from predators or parasites while they rest. Some sharks can rest on the seafloor if they have a way to keep water moving over their gills, while others must continue swimming. Sea turtles can sleep underwater for extended periods and then surface to breathe, while marine mammals that breathe air must manage sleep in shorter, more controlled ways. Every one of these patterns is a specific answer to a specific problem. It also helps to remember that the ocean punishes waste. Energy matters. Staying alert all the time costs energy. Moving all the time costs energy. Failing to recover from the wear and tear of daily life costs energy too, and eventually much more than energy. So marine animals must rest somehow. The question is not whether they have found a way to avoid the need entirely. The question is how their bodies and behaviours have carved out room for rest inside an environment that keeps demanding motion, awareness, and caution. If you have ever fallen asleep on a bus, on a plane, or in some half-comfortable position because you were simply tired enough to negotiate with discomfort, then you already know a tiny human version of this principle. The body wants restoration badly enough that it can improvise. Ocean creatures are that principle taken much further, shaped not by one awkward afternoon but by entire evolutionary histories. They're improvising with fins, gills, lungs, buoyancy, camouflage, pressure, and instinct. They're resting with whatever tools their lineage happened to bring into the water. Now, one reason this topic works so well for an evening listen is that it slowly rearranges something familiar. Sleep feels ordinary because we do it every day, and because we experience it from the inside. But from the outside, even human sleep is a bit odd. We spend around a third of our lives in a vulnerable state, disconnected enough from the environment that loud noises, movement, or danger must cross a threshold before we respond. That would be a very strange design choice if it did not do something essential. So when we look at marine life and see all these alternate methods, what we are really looking at is the deep importance of rest expressed in many different body plans. The need stays, the form changes. There is comfort in that, though not in a sentimental way. More in the sense that life is practical. It does not insist on one correct template if the template stops working. It adjusts. If full unconsciousness is unsafe, it trims it back. If open water is too exposed, it looks for rock, coral, sand, or kelp. If breathing requires awareness, then awareness is rationed instead of abandoned. If night brings hunters, then the timing shifts. If a creature lives where day and night barely matter, internal rhythms do more of the work. Sleep, rest, quiet states, lowered activity, call them what you like, they all become part of the same larger project, which is staying alive long enough to continue. So tonight, as we start moving through this underwater problem step by step, it helps to leave behind the idea that the sea is filled with animals doing a worse version of what we do on land. That is not what is happening. The sea is filled with animals doing a highly adapted version of what their bodies can afford. Some of them will look almost relatable, some will look absurd, some will look as though they have ignored the assignment entirely. By the end of it, the real surprise is usually not that ocean creatures do not sleep like we do. It is that sleep, once you stop demanding a single definition, turns out to be one of the most flexible things life ever invented. And that is where it becomes useful to begin with the basic question itself. Because before we get into one half of a dolphin's brain keeping watch, or reef fish slipping into hidden ledges, or creatures that seem to drift in and out of stillness with barely any obvious signal at all, we should get clear on what we actually mean by sleep when the body in question is underwater, cold-blooded or warm-blooded, breathing through gills or lungs, and built nothing like us in the first place. Because once that definition starts to widen, the rest of the ocean starts making a lot more sense. When we talk about sleep on land, most of us picture something very specific. A quiet room, a body stretched out or curled up, eyes closed, muscles relaxed, breathing steady, a clear break from the business of the day. It feels simple because it is familiar. We know what sleep looks like in ourselves, in other people, in pets, in birds settled onto branches, even in a child who clearly fell asleep 2 pages into a bedtime story and is now pretending they are still listening. But the moment you carry that definition underwater, it starts losing parts almost immediately. The ocean has a way of taking familiar ideas and asking whether we are quite sure we meant them that narrowly. For one thing, many ocean creatures do not have eyelids. That already ruins one of our favourite visual clues. A fish can be resting and still look faintly alert simply because it does not have the hardware for a dramatic shut-eye moment. Some animals do not lie down because there is nowhere obvious to lie down. Some cannot fully stop moving. Some must keep rising to breathe. Some do not have brains organised in the way mammals do, which makes it awkward to search for human-style sleep stages in a body that never agreed to the comparison in the first place. So before we can ask how ocean creatures sleep, we need to ask a more basic question. What actually counts as sleep when the environment is water and the body has been built around that fact from the beginning? Scientists usually avoid defining sleep by one single outward behaviour because that becomes a mess very quickly. Stillness alone is not enough. A creature might be still because it is cold, hiding, injured, digesting, conserving energy, or trying not to attract attention. Closed eyes are not enough either, for obvious reasons. Instead, sleep tends to be identified through a cluster of signs. There is usually reduced activity, reduced responsiveness to the environment, some preferred posture or location, a regular timing pattern, and perhaps most importantly, a rebound effect. If the animal is deprived of that rest state, it tends to make up for it later. That last part matters because it tells you the state is biologically important, not just optional loafing. That is useful on land, and it becomes even more useful in the sea, because the ocean is full of animals that rest in ways that do not look especially dramatic. A fish hovering quietly near a coral head may not impress you with its bedtime routine, but if it becomes less responsive, returns to that state regularly, and compensates when deprived of it, then we are looking at something that functions a lot like sleep, even if no one is wearing pyjamas. The same goes for jellyfish that pulse less often during certain periods, or cuttlefish that settle and show changes in behaviour that resemble rest, or dolphins that let one side of the brain rest while the other remains active enough to keep breathing and stay aware of the surroundings. Sleep underwater is not one fixed package. It is a set of biological needs being met under very different conditions, and those conditions matter more than almost anything else. On land, gravity pins you down to a surface, and most of the time that is useful. A bed works because you can trust that you will remain on it, unless something unusual happens. Underwater, buoyancy changes the whole conversation. Bodies can float, hover, drift, sink gently, wedge themselves, or be carried by currents. Rest has to account for movement in the environment. A creature may not need a mattress, but it may need somewhere sheltered from the flow, somewhere that keeps it from being pushed into danger or swept out into open water. So a reef fish may tuck itself into a crevice, a turtle may wedge under a ledge, and an octopus may seal itself inside a den with stones and shells. These are not just convenient spots. They are sleeping arrangements shaped by physics. Then there is breathing, which may be the single biggest reason underwater sleep becomes so strange. Humans breathe air automatically. We can sleep deeply because the body keeps handling the basics. Most fish extract oxygen from water through gills, which creates one set of demands. Marine mammals breathe air too, but they live in water, which creates another. A dolphin cannot simply go fully unconscious for the night and trust its body to sort out respiration without supervision. It has to surface for air deliberately. That means some level of alertness must remain. As a result, dolphins and some other cetaceans are known for unihemispheric sleep, where one hemisphere of the brain rests while the other stays more active. One eye often remains open. It sounds like the kind of arrangement a very anxious office worker would invent after too much coffee and one truly bad deadline. But in dolphins, it is elegant and necessary. Half the brain rests, the animal keeps swimming, breathing and monitoring the world, and then the sides alternate. Once you understand that, the question shifts. It is no longer, why don't they sleep properly? It becomes, given the conditions, how could they possibly sleep any other way? That is usually the better question in biology. Animals are not lazy attempts at being us. They are functional answers to their own lives. Sleep underwater means solving for oxygen, movement, temperature, predators, and energy use all at once. Every species solves that slightly differently. Predators are a major part of the story too. Sleep makes you vulnerable. That is true everywhere, but vulnerability in the ocean is complicated by visibility and access. On land, walls and doors help. In the sea, hiding places are more limited and often shared. A small fish trying to rest on a reef is living in a crowded neighbourhood with many residents and an unknown number of criminals. If it chooses the wrong spot, it may not be there by morning. So sleep often becomes closely tied to camouflage, shelter or timing. Some fish change colour at night, becoming duller or paler. Some secrete mucus cocoons around themselves. Parrotfish are famous for this odd bit of bedtime engineering. Wrapped in a transparent mucus envelope, they may reduce their scent trail and make it harder for parasites or predators to detect them. It is not glamorous, but then very few survival strategies are. Nature is rarely trying to be elegant. It is trying to get through the night. The ocean also changes how much light matters. Near the surface, day and night still structure life in obvious ways. Reef communities can be bustling during the day and much quieter at night, though quiet is relative when half the neighbourhood is merely trading shifts. Diurnal species rest while nocturnal hunters come out. But as depth increases, sunlight fades rapidly. In deep water, circadian rhythms may be shaped less by direct light and more by food cycles, internal clocks, or faint cues from above. So when we ask what sleep means underwater, we also have to loosen our dependence on darkness as the main trigger. For some marine animals, rest is linked to the clock. For others, it is linked to opportunity. If prey rises at night, a predator may rest by day. If conditions change with tides, then sleep and activity may follow water movement rather than sunrise. Another important difference is temperature. Most marine creatures are ectothermic, which means their body temperature is influenced by the environment. That affects metabolism, activity, and rest. A colder body often means slower processes. In some animals, periods of low movement may partly reflect this slowed metabolic state, which can make it harder to distinguish passive slowing from active sleep. Researchers therefore need more than casual observation. They look at patterns. Does the animal enter the state regularly? Is it harder to rouse? Does it return to a preferred position? Is there a compensatory increase after deprivation? This is why sleep research in marine life is often surprisingly technical. It is not enough to say, that fish looks sleepy. Science requires stronger evidence, however expressive the fish may have seemed. And some fish do seem sleepy, at least by behaviour. Many species settle into a stable position at night and become less responsive. Coral reef fish often retreat to known shelters. Some wedge themselves so firmly that they remain secure even if the water moves around them. If disturbed, they can wake quickly and dart off, which tells you they are not deeply gone in the human sense, but their threshold for response is higher than during active hours. Their metabolism may slow. Their colouring may shift. In some lab studies, fish deprived of rest later show longer or deeper quiet periods, which again points toward genuine sleep-like states. The details vary by species, because a clownfish is not living the same life as a wrasse, and neither is living the same life as a shark or tuna. Sharks make the whole subject more interesting because they refuse to behave consistently enough for convenient summaries. Some sharks can rest on the seafloor and use buccal pumping, actively moving water across their gills while staying mostly still. Nurse sharks are a good example. Others rely more heavily on ram ventilation, meaning they need to keep moving to push water over their gills. Those species cannot simply park themselves for the night in the way many fish can. Their rest may happen while swimming slowly or in altered states that are harder for us to detect. This is one reason the old simplistic line that sharks never sleep does not really hold up. What is true is that some sharks cannot stop moving entirely without consequences. What follows from that is not therefore no rest, but therefore rest must look different. Sea turtles provide a different version of the same theme. They breathe air, but unlike dolphins, they do not need to remain as continuously active to manage it. They can hold their breath for long periods, especially while resting. Turtles have been observed sleeping underwater, often tucked into reefs, under ledges, or on the sea floor, surfacing periodically for air. In this case, the ocean permits something much closer to our idea of sleep, though still not identical. They are not in a bedroom. They are in a place chosen for safety and stability, carrying out a rest pattern that suits a reptile body in a marine setting. Again, the point is not that sleep disappears underwater. The point is that each body negotiates it differently. Now, if mammals such as dolphins and reptiles such as turtles already show how flexible rest can be, invertebrates take the conversation even further. Octopuses are a particularly fascinating case because they are intelligent, behaviourally rich, and physically unlike us in nearly every respect. They spend periods quietly resting, often in dens, with altered body patterns and reduced responsiveness. Some studies have even described active sleep-like states in octopuses that include rapid skin colour changes and body twitches, raising comparisons cautiously to REM-like sleep invertebrates. One should always be careful here. An octopus is not a person in a wet costume. It is its own thing entirely. Still, the existence of complex rest patterns in an animal so evolutionarily distant from us suggests something important. Sleep, or sleep-like states, may be a very broad biological solution, not a narrow mammalian specialty. Cuttlefish are another case that delights scientists because they combine rich behaviour with a body that seems perpetually ready to complicate any easy category. They have been observed entering quiet periods and then showing bursts of activity, eye movements, and skin pattern changes during rest, again suggesting phases that are not unlike sleep states seen in other animals. No one should rush into declaring that cuttlefish dream about administrative paperwork or awkward school memories, but the presence of structured rest states in such animals tells us that the benefits of cycling between different kinds of rest may reach far across the animal kingdom. Then there are animals with much simpler nervous systems. Jellyfish do not have a central brain like ours. For a long time, that made people less inclined to ask whether they sleep at all, yet research has shown that some jellyfish exhibit nighttime decreases in activity and are slower to respond during those periods. If disturbed, they can show something like sleep rebound later. That matters because it suggests sleep-like states may not require a large, centralised brain in the way we once assumed, which is both scientifically interesting and faintly annoying, because just when you think you're closing in on a clean definition, a jellyfish drifts by and ruins your certainty without even possessing a proper face. So what is sleep doing for these animals if it comes in so many different forms? That is the next useful question. In humans, sleep helps with memory, tissue repair, metabolic regulation, immune function, emotional processing, and a long list of other maintenance work. While we cannot assume every marine animal uses sleep for all the same reasons, the broad logic still holds. Living bodies need downtime, neurons need regulation, energy needs to be managed, systems need maintenance. The precise balance of benefits may differ by species, but the overall need for some form of reduced activity and restoration is hard to escape. Evolution can reshape the format, but it rarely abandons the function without a replacement. That replacement in many marine creatures is not less rest. It is more specialised rest. A dolphin uses only half the brain at a time. A reef fish hides and lowers responsiveness. A parrotfish adds a mucus layer. A shark may cruise slowly instead of stopping. A turtle breathes less frequently while settled under a ledge. An octopus retreats to a den and cycles through quiet and active states. These are not separate stories so much as variations on one theme. The sea does not eliminate sleep. It edits it. It trims away whatever is unsafe or impractical and keeps what still works. It is also worth noticing how often place matters. On land, we sometimes treat sleep as a private biological act that happens inside the body, and of course it is. But in the ocean, it becomes very obvious that sleep is also ecological. Where you rest matters as much as how. A coral crevice, a kelp bed, a sandy patch, a ledge, an open current, a den made of stones, all of these locations shape what kind of rest is possible. A good resting place reduces risk, saves energy, and sometimes even helps with oxygen flow. That is why some animals return to the same shelters again and again. Sleep underwater is part body state, part real estate decision. For marine mammals, the social setting can matter too. Dolphins may rest in groups, maintaining coordinated behaviour while individuals cycle through partial sleep. This is another reminder that sleep is not only biological but behavioural. It interacts with the life of the species. A solitary ambush predator, a schooling fish, a migrating turtle, and a pod-living dolphin are not merely different animals, they are different sleep problems. The deeper you go into the subject, the more sleep starts to look like a family resemblance term rather than a single, neatly boxed thing. There are shared traits, overlapping functions, and recurring signs, but not one universal performance. That can feel unsatisfying if you like crisp definitions. On the other hand, it is exactly what you should expect from evolution. Life rarely invents one perfect answer and then sticks to it everywhere. It modifies, compromises, repurposes, and adapts. Underwater, where the basic conditions are so unlike our own that flexibility becomes impossible to miss. This is why it helps to let go of the idea that sleep must involve a total surrender to unconsciousness. In many marine animals, that would be too risky. What counts instead may be a shift into reduced activity, reduced responsiveness, lower energy use and protected behaviour. Sometimes the brain rests in sections, sometimes the body keeps moving slowly, sometimes the animal hides, sometimes it pulses less. Sometimes it does something that looks so unlike our own sleep that we only recognise it after careful study. And once you accept that, the ocean stops seeming full of insomniacs and starts seeming full of highly practical sleepers. There is, admittedly, something slightly humbling about that. Humans are often very attached to our own template. We build a definition around ourselves and then act surprised when a shark, a jellyfish, and an octopus decline to cooperate. But the ocean is useful in that way. It keeps reminding us that familiar does not mean universal. A bed is not the essence of sleep. Closed eyes are not the essence of sleep. Stillness is not the essence of sleep. The essence, as far as biology seems to care, is whether a body gets the restorative pause it needs without dying in the process. Once you phrase it like that, the marine world starts looking less strange and more very sensible, and that wider view matters, because as soon as we stop demanding one strict image of rest, we can begin to notice the many ways ocean life becomes quiet without fully shutting down, the many ways bodies negotiate danger and recovery at the same time, and the many ways stillness, shelter, drifting, hovering, or partial alertness can all serve the same deeper purpose, which is why the next step is to look at those quieter states more closely, because underwater, going still is rarely one simple thing. If you spend enough time watching the sea, one thing becomes obvious fairly quickly. Stillness underwater does not all mean the same thing. A creature may stop because it is resting, because it is waiting, because it is hiding, because it is conserving energy, because it is trying very hard not to become dinner, or because it has found a way to combine several of those goals at once, from our side of the glass, or from the deck of a boat, or while watching dim footage from a reef camera in the middle of the night, that stillness can look deceptively simple. A fish hovering near coral does not exactly announce whether it is asleep, alert, pretending to be boring, or all three. The ocean is full of animals that have learned to go quiet without fully surrendering themselves, and that makes rest underwater look less like a clean-off switch and more like a collection of careful compromises. That is one of the reasons this part of the story matters so much. Once you accept that ocean creatures do not sleep in one single familiar way, the next thing to notice is how many different versions of going still there actually are. Some drift, some wedge themselves, some bury themselves, some float in place, some slip into holes in the reef and vanish so neatly that you would never know the neighbourhood was full of sleeping residents. Some change colour, some hide behind slime, some slow their movements until they nearly disappear into the background of the water itself. Each of these behaviours looks modest from the outside. Taken together, they amount to a whole underwater culture of not moving any more than absolutely necessary. Drifting is perhaps the gentlest of these states, though not necessarily the safest. In human terms, drifting sounds peaceful. It sounds like a hammock, a nap in the backseat of a car, a lazy afternoon where the hardest decision is whether it is worth getting up for tea. In the ocean, drifting can be peaceful, but only if the animal in question has been built for it, or has chosen the conditions carefully. For some small creatures in the water column, rest may involve lowering activity and letting buoyancy do more of the work. They are not exactly asleep in a human sense, and they are not exactly doing nothing either. They are remaining in the water with just enough effort to avoid trouble, allowing the body to reduce its pace without giving the environment a completely free hand. This can be easier in some parts of the ocean than in others. Calm water is helpful. Shelter from strong currents is helpful too. A creature that drifts in the wrong place may find itself nudged into open water, into a predator's patrol route, or into a patch of ocean where hiding opportunities have been reduced to almost none. That is why drifting is often less random than it appears. Many animals choose depth, position, or time of day in ways that make quiet floating safer. Even plankton, which we often imagine as helpless passengers of the sea, are not always passive. Many move up and down in the water column on daily cycles, adjusting their position with striking consistency. They are tiny, but not thoughtless. The ocean rewards attention to timing, even at the scale of creatures that could fit into a sentence more easily than into a hand. For larger animals, drifting may appear as hovering. Reef fish often do this in a way that is easy to miss if you're expecting a dramatic bedtime performance. They may settle into a favoured spot near coral or rock, and maintain a nearly motionless position with only slight fin movements. The body is still, but not limp. The animal is present, but not fully engaged. That tiny difference matters. Hovering allows a fish to remain oriented in the water, avoid being knocked about, and react quickly if something goes wrong. It is the marine version of sleeping in your clothes with one ear open because the neighbourhood has a reputation, and you do not entirely trust it after dark. And the reef at night is exactly the sort of place that produces this kind of practical behaviour. During daylight, coral reefs can look impossibly busy. Fish dart, graze, chase, hover, and inspect one another's business with all the shameless interest of a small town with no curtains. At night, many of those same fish retreat into the structure of the reef and become far less active. They do not all simply lie down, partly because lying down is not an especially useful idea when much of the world is vertical, branched, or moving. Instead, they tuck themselves into crevices, wedge between coral branches, or settle near the bottom in a stable position. From a distance, the reef may look emptier. Up close, it is full of hidden bodies doing their best to disappear. That word, disappear, is one of the most important in the whole discussion. Hiding is one of the sea's main answers to the problem of rest. If sleep increases vulnerability, then the obvious solution is to reduce the chance of being noticed in the first place. Reef fish are very good at this. Some species squeeze into gaps so narrow that it seems they have turned sideways out of pure spite. Others choose places whose shape matches their body so neatly that even a predator scanning nearby might miss them. Colour change often helps. Fish that are bright and obvious during the day may become duller or blotchier at night, which makes them less visible in the patchy moonlit landscape of the reef. A sleeping fish does not need to win a beauty contest. It needs to make somebody else overlook it. Parrotfish take this impulse toward invisibility and make it wonderfully weird. At night, some species produce a mucus cocoon around themselves. It sounds like the sort of thing that would get you removed from a luxury hotel, but in the sea it may help with protection. Scientists believe the cocoon can mask chemical cues that predators or parasites might use to detect the fish. It is not armour. It is more like a scent management strategy wrapped in a transparent envelope. The fish remains in place, enclosed in its own personal bubble of discretion, which is a surprisingly refined way to spend the night for an animal that spends the day scraping algae off coral with a beak-like mouth. Nature does enjoy contrast. Wrasses and other reef fish have their own versions of hiding. Some nestle into coral, some settle close to the substrate, others bury themselves in sand. That last method is especially practical if you're a fish, and your local environment offers both fine sediment and a range of creatures interested in eating anything left lying around. Rather than remain visible, certain species dive into the sand at night and vanish beneath the surface. From above, there may be little or no sign that anything is there. Beneath the sand, however, the fish is resting in a place that is relatively concealed, temperature buffered, and inconvenient for a casual predator to inspect. It is not a luxurious arrangement, but then sleep is rarely about luxury in the ocean. It is about getting through several vulnerable hours without becoming a useful anecdote in another animal's digestive system. The seafloor more generally offers many such possibilities. Animals that live near or on the bottom often turn the landscape into a set of resting tools. A flounder can settle flat against the sediment and nearly vanish. Rays can rest partially covered by sand. Some sharks, especially those able to pump water over their gills, while still, may rest on the bottom or in caves. Nurse sharks are a good example of this quieter style. They do not need to cruise constantly in open water to the same extent as some other sharks, so they can gather in resting spots where the body is largely still, even if the surroundings are not. That image of a shark lying around may disappoint anyone who wanted the animal to be a permanent symbol of unstoppable menace, but biology is not especially interested in maintaining your dramatic branding. Even predators need downtime. Caves, ledges and overhangs matter a great deal for the same reason. An exposed body is an invitation. A body tucked under rock is a problem. Many marine animals understand this in the only way evolution requires, which is not as a conscious theory but as a patterned behaviour shaped by survival. A sea turtle may wedge itself beneath a rock shelf. Moray eels may retreat deeper into crevices. Lobsters and crabs remain tucked under cover during quiet periods. Octopuses, perhaps the undisputed masters of turning a hole into a private residence, retire to dens and can even arrange objects near the entrance. That is less about furniture taste and more about control. A den narrows access, it limits angles of attack, it creates a known space in an unknown world. For an octopus, which has no shell and an unfortunate number of admirers with sharp teeth, a well-chosen den is not just a resting place. It is the difference between a manageable night and a disastrous one. Octopuses are particularly good examples because their stillness is never entirely simple. When resting, an octopus may soften its body, change colour, and become much less responsive. Yet even then, it remains an octopus, which means there is a strong chance it is also doing something slightly suspicious looking. The body may subtly pulse, the skin may shift. At times it may appear limp, then suddenly attentive. In more active sleep-like states, researchers have observed rapid skin pattern changes and movements that suggest the nervous system is cycling through something more complex than simple inactivity. Watching that happen is both fascinating and vaguely intrusive, as though you have stumbled into a room where the furniture is processing its feelings. Stillness in the sea also depends on how much an animal can trust its own body to remain where it puts it. Sea otters, which straddle the line between marine and mammalian familiarity, offer one of the clearest examples of active resting logistics. When they sleep at the surface, they may wrap themselves in kelp to keep from drifting away. Sometimes groups of otters hold hands, or at least remain linked closely enough to avoid separation. It sounds charming because it is charming, but it is also practical. The surface ocean is not a stable platform. It moves. Wind and current can pull bodies apart. Kelp gives the otter something like an anchor. That is a marine sleeping tool every bit as real as a pillow, only greener and more likely to contain small crustaceans. Seals and sea lions complicate the matter further because they divide their lives between land and water. On land, many can sleep in ways that look much more familiar to us. In water, their behaviour changes. Some float. Some rest while surfacing regularly. Some species can sleep in short bouts with parts of the brain more alert, particularly in aquatic settings. This contrast is useful because it shows how much environment shapes resting behaviour even within the same broad kind of animal. A seal on a beach can sprawl with enviable confidence. The same animal in the water must treat stillness more cautiously. It is the same body, but not the same sleep problem. Then there are animals for whom motion itself becomes the framework of rest. Certain sharks and fast-swimming fish cannot simply switch to total immobility whenever they please. Water flow across the gills, body design and lifestyle all push against that. As a result, rest may occur during slow, steady movement. This is one of the stranger things for humans to imagine, because we associate rest with stopping. But it makes sense if stopping would interfere with breathing or control. A slow cruise, a reduced pace, a lower level of responsiveness, these may be enough. The body is not fully off, but it is quieter. The baseline has dropped. In effect, movement becomes the price of admission for rest. That sounds tiring, and it probably is by our standards, but the comparison is unfair. These animals are not secretly wishing for a duvet and blackout curtains. They are built for a different arrangement. Jellyfish and other soft-bodied drifters make stillness look simpler, though that simplicity can be misleading. A jellyfish pulsing less often at certain times may appear to be doing almost nothing, yet that reduction in activity can still represent a meaningful rest state. The same is true for many small marine creatures, whose behaviour changes more by rhythm than by dramatic posture. To us, it can seem as though nothing has happened. To the animal, metabolism has shifted, responsiveness has dropped, and the pattern is regular enough to matter. One lesson the ocean repeats often is that visible drama is not the same as biological importance. A creature does not need to snore to prove it had a long day. Sometimes the most effective way to go still is simply to become part of the scenery. Camouflage and rest are close partners underwater. A cuttlefish or octopus can alter appearance to match the surroundings so well that stillness completes the illusion. A fish with mottled patterns resting among rock and coral becomes harder to separate from the reef itself. A flatfish lying on the bottom looks less like an animal than a suggestion. This is helpful not only for avoiding predators, but for reducing the need for constant vigilance. The more invisible you are, the less often you must interrupt your rest to investigate every passing shadow. In that sense, camouflage buys time. It purchases a little more safety, a little more quiet, and a slightly better chance of reaching morning with all parts still attached. It is worth remembering too that not all stillness is nighttime stillness. Many ocean creatures rest during the day because their active lives happen after dark. Nocturnal hunting, feeding, or wandering means daytime becomes the safer or more practical window for reduced activity. So the reef that looks peaceful under the sun may contain hidden daytime sleepers, while the same reef at night becomes a shift change full of movement. In the open ocean as well, vertical migrations mean countless animals spend one part of the day deep and relatively inactive, then rise at night toward food-rich upper waters. The sea runs on schedules layered over one another. One animal's bedtime is another's commute. There is also a social side to going still. Schooling fish may rest in groups, each individual benefiting from the presence of others, even if alertness is reduced. Marine mammals sometimes remain in coordinated formations during rest. Group living changes the math. More eyes, or at least more available responders, make a quieter state safer. This is not so different from the way many land animals sleep more comfortably in groups, but the ocean adds currents, three-dimensional spacing, and the persistent inconvenience of needing not to lose each other in moving water. Staying near companions can matter as much as choosing the right ledge, and if all of this begins to sound as though underwater rest is mostly about not getting killed, that is because it often is. Yet it would be wrong to think of it only as fear management. Rest also saves energy, supports recovery, and allows the animal to keep functioning day after day. A fish hiding in coral is not merely avoiding death, it is managing life. The body cannot remain at full activity indefinitely. Muscles tire, nervous systems need recalibration, energy must be spent carefully. Going still is part of that economy. The ocean may be full of motion, but every creature in it lives by a budget, and stillness is one of the ways the budget balances. That practical side of the story is one reason marine stillness can look so modest. There is no grand ceremony. A fish slides into a crack. A turtle settles under a ledge. A shark rests in a cave. A seahorse anchors itself with its tail. An otter tangles itself in kelp. A cuttlefish goes pale and quiet. A jellyfish pulses less often. Small acts, repeated nightly or daily, add up to survival. If you did not know what you were looking at, you might miss them entirely. Yet the sea depends on these quiet states just as much as on bursts of speed, feeding frenzies, or spectacular migrations. The dramatic moments get the documentaries. The hidden pauses keep the animals alive long enough to star in them. And there is something pleasingly sensible about that. Humans can be very theatrical about sleep. We discuss pillows with the seriousness of treaty negotiations. We adjust blankets by fractions. We develop preferences so elaborate they begin to sound like technical requirements for launching a satellite. Ocean creatures, by contrast, seem to take a more stripped-down approach. Find a place, reduce movement, stay hard to detect, resume existence later. It is not unromantic. It is efficient. Even the oddest marine resting behaviours start to look straightforward once you view them through that lens. Drifting is not laziness. It is low-cost suspension. Hiding is not cowardice. It is intelligent risk reduction. Hovering is not indecision. It is controlled stillness in a moving environment. Burying is not overreaction. It is concealment with benefits. Resting in motion is not a failure to stop. It is the only version of stopping a particular body can afford. The sea has taken the idea of stillness and broken it into many workable pieces, which is why the ocean feels so different from land when you watch animals settle down. On land, rest often gathers around one familiar picture. Underwater, it fragments into many small methods, each shaped by body design, habitat, and danger. That variety is not a side note, it is the point. The sea does not offer one easy answer to the problem of vulnerability. It offers ledges, currents, sand, camouflage, darkness, slime, schools, kelp, and partial alertness. Life uses all of them. From there, the next thing that starts to stand out is that some animals do more than hide or hover quietly. Some keep part of themselves awake while the rest powers down, and once you meet those creatures, the whole idea of sleep begins to look even less like a full shutdown and more like a careful division of labour, which is where the ocean becomes especially strange because a few of its residents have found a way to rest without ever fully closing the door on the world. There are few phrases in the animal world that sound more like a metaphor and turn out to be almost annoyingly literal than sleeping with one eye open. For humans, it usually means light sleep, worry, or the sort of night you have after saying, "I'll just have one coffee after dinner," and then immediately realising you have made a tactical error. In the ocean, though, for some animals, it is not a figure of speech at all. It is a workable solution, an elegant one even. If you live in a place where rest is necessary but total unconsciousness could be dangerous, then the obvious compromise is to stop resting all at once and start resting in shifts. That sounds like something invented by a manager trying to avoid hiring enough staff, but nature got there first. To see why this matters, it helps to start with a basic human assumption. When we sleep, we generally assume the whole system is going offline together. Not all parts of the brain are doing the same thing at the same time, of course, and human sleep is more complicated than a simple power down, but the overall experience is unified. We go to sleep as one person, not as two halves taking turns. We do not usually leave one side of the brain on watch while the other clocks out, unless you count that part of your mind that remembers embarrassing conversations from 2017 at 2:13 in the morning. For most of us, sleep means surrendering a lot of awareness at once, but surrender is expensive in the sea. That is true for a great many animals, and it's especially true for those that breathe air while living in water. Dolphins are the classic example. They are mammals, warm-blooded, highly social, intelligent, and in possession of the sort of permanent expression that has convinced generations of humans they must always be having a wonderful time. This is not necessarily the case. Faces can be misleading. What is not misleading is the fact that dolphins cannot simply fall into deep, fully unconscious sleep the way we do. They have to keep breathing on purpose. Every breath requires surfacing. If both halves of the brain shut down at once for an extended period, the logistics become rather grim rather quickly. So dolphins do something remarkable. They rest one hemisphere of the brain at a time. One side slows into a sleep state, while the other remains awake enough to manage breathing, movement, and awareness of the environment. Then later the roles switch. It is known as unihemispheric slow-wave sleep, which sounds technical because it is, but the underlying logic is beautifully plain. One side takes the night shift, the other gets a break, then they swap. There is something almost domestic about it. The brain does not insist on everyone working through exhaustion together, it rotates the duties. This arrangement also affects the eyes. Because each eye is largely connected to the opposite hemisphere of the brain, the eye opposite the sleeping hemisphere is usually closed or less active, while the eye opposite the more alert hemisphere remains open. That is where the phrase becomes literal. A dolphin may quite genuinely be resting with one eye open. It is not being spooky, it is staying alive. And once you picture that, the ocean starts making more sense. A dolphin cannot sprawl somewhere, vanish into total unawareness and hope the morning goes well. It must surface. It must remain coordinated enough not to drift into danger. It must stay loosely connected to the pod. It must continue existing in a three-dimensional world where there is no floor you can fully trust, no room to lock, and no guarantee that whatever is nearby means well. One eye open is not paranoia in that setting. It is policy. The same general principle applies to some whales as well, though species differ and much is still being studied. Cetaceans, the group that includes dolphins, porpoises and whales, face similar problems because they breathe air voluntarily. Their resting behaviour often involves slow swimming, quiet floating, or reduced movement near the surface while maintaining enough control to breathe and remain aware. The ocean allows rest, but not total neglect. That is a very different arrangement from ours, where sleep can become deep enough that someone else may have to tell us whether it rained during the night. One of the most interesting things about this one-eyed, half-brain-at-a-time system is that it solves several problems at once. Breathing is the obvious one. Predator awareness is another. Even large marine mammals are not entirely free from danger, especially when they are young. A calf and its mother need to remain connected. A resting animal needs to stay oriented. It helps too with navigation and social cohesion. Dolphins often rest in groups, moving slowly together. They are quieter, less active, but not absent. That continuity matters. Group life in the sea depends on keeping track of one another in conditions that are often dim, moving, and spread out. There is also a lovely practicality to the way nature solves the impossible by refusing to keep the original terms of the problem. If full sleep is unsafe, then sleep is divided. If unconsciousness is too costly, then consciousness is reduced in sections. Humans can be quite rigid in our expectations. We hear the word sleep and imagine one correct performance. Dark room, horizontal body, full disengagement, perhaps a blanket if fortune smiles. Dolphins look at that model, If dolphins indeed spare any time at all for judging our lifestyle choices and simply do not use it, they have found a way to rest that fits their body and their environment. The ocean did not hand them ideal conditions, so biology rewrote the plan. It is worth pausing here to appreciate how different that makes the experience of rest. Imagine having to remain partly aware through the night, because the act of not noticing things could become a serious problem. We sometimes taste a faint version of that in human life. A parent sleeping lightly because there is a newborn nearby. A person camping in unfamiliar weather. Someone half aware in an airport chair, never fully settled because the situation is clearly nonsense. But those are temporary states for us, exceptions from the usual rule. For some marine mammals, divided alertness is simply how rest works. The young make the whole picture even more demanding. Newborn dolphins and their mothers show especially unusual sleep patterns in the early period after birth. For a while, both may remain highly active with very little of the quiet, floating or stillness one might expect from a mammal after a major life event. This likely reflects the practical needs of staying mobile, surfacing often, and remaining protected during a vulnerable stage. It is not exactly the image of a peaceful maternity ward. It is closer to an exhausting but efficient moving partnership in open water. Human parenting is tiring enough with walls, chairs, and the possibility of tea. Doing it while swimming and breathing deliberately is another level of commitment entirely. And yet, despite the demands, this strategy works. That may be the most important thing to remember. It sounds impossible to us because it is not how our own nervous system is arranged. But dolphins are not underperforming humans. They are successful dolphins. Their sleep has been shaped by millions of years of marine living. If a method continues in a lineage, that is usually because it has managed the core problem well enough to keep producing more of itself. Evolution is not sentimental. It does not reward creatures for looking well rested in a relatable way. It rewards workable systems. Other animals show milder or different versions of this principle. Some seals, depending on whether they are on land or in the water, can alter how they sleep. On land, they may sleep with both brain hemispheres more fully involved in a way that resembles terrestrial mammalian sleep much more closely. In water, the pattern can shift, with unihemispheric sleep helping them continue to surface and manage the environment. That contrast is especially revealing because it shows how flexible sleep can be, even within a single animal. Put the same body in different settings and the nervous system uses different tools. A seal on shore can relax in a heap like a damp aristocrat avoiding appointments. In the water, it becomes more strategic. Birds, although not ocean creatures in the same way, offer a useful parallel because some species also use unihemispheric sleep, especially when exposed to danger or while in unusual situations like migration. That tells us the principle itself is not unique to cetaceans. The larger pattern is that when full vulnerability becomes too costly, some animals solve the problem by keeping part of the brain on watch. It is not so much a quirky trick as a serious biological option. Still, the marine version remains especially striking because of the additional challenge of breathing. For a dolphin, not noticing the need to surface is not a small oversight. It is the kind of oversight that ends the meeting. So the sleeping brain cannot simply surrender the whole body and hope reflexes will cover the rest. Dolphins breathe voluntarily, not automatically in the same way humans do during sleep. That alone makes their resting life profoundly different from ours. We fall asleep and trust the machinery. Dolphins fall asleep and keep a manager on duty. And the open eye itself is not just for show. The alert hemisphere remains able to monitor the surroundings to some degree. It can help detect movement, maintain position in relation to pod members, and stay responsive enough that the animal is not entirely cut off. In a dark or murky environment, even partial awareness is valuable. Ocean life has a way of making every little bit of usable information matter. A ripple, a shape, the position of a companion, a change in sound. Any of these could be important. Total absence from the world would be too expensive, so dolphins rest while still keeping contact with it. There is a quiet irony in that. because from the outside dolphins can appear so smooth and effortless. They arc out of the water, move with apparent ease, and seem to belong fully to their world in a way humans, with our boats, flippers, tanks, and very conditional confidence, decidedly do not. It is easy to look at that grace and imagine the rest of their lives must also be simple. But then you discover that even sleep has to be negotiated with extraordinary care, and the apparent ease begins to look more like the product of very exact design. This also changes the emotional flavour of sleep, if one can say that without wandering into melodrama. Human sleep often feels like release. The day ends, responsibilities fade, the mind lets go, at least when it is feeling cooperative, which admittedly cannot always be assumed. Marine mammals that sleep unihemispherically do not get that same all-at-once release. Their version of rest is more like managed reduction. Enough quiet to restore the system, enough awareness to survive. It is efficient, but it is not indulgent. There is no marine equivalent of deciding to sleep in because it is raining, and your calendar has finally stopped making threats. Of course, not every ocean creature that keeps one eye open is doing exactly the dolphin version of this. Fish, for instance, often appear to sleep with their eyes open, simply because they lack eyelids. That can make them look faintly unsettling to human observers, as though they are judging the entire room while asleep, which in fairness some of them may deserve to. But outwardly, open eyes in fish do not always mean active vigilance in the same structured sense as a dolphin's unihemispheric sleep. This is where one must be careful. Similar appearances can arise from different biology. A resting fish and a resting dolphin may both seem to have one or both eyes open, but the mechanisms beneath that surface are not necessarily the same. Even so, the broader point remains. In the sea, eyes do not always close just because rest has begun. Humans rely heavily on faces for clues. We trust closed eyes, slack expressions, and stillness. Remove those signals and we become oddly uncertain. Is the animal awake? Is it resting? Is it plotting? Often the answer is that it is resting in a way that does not care whether we find the performance reassuring. Ocean creatures are under no obligation to make bedtime legible to us. And there is an advantage to that visual ambiguity. Looking less obviously asleep may itself be helpful. Predators cue in on vulnerability. If an animal's resting state preserves some posture, some muscle tone, some orientation, or some hint of readiness that may reduce risk. Sleeping with one eye open, whether literal or functional, sends a basic message. This body is quieter than before, but not entirely unavailable. Approach with care. There is also a social dimension worth noting. In dolphin groups, individuals often coordinate their behaviour while resting. They do not all need to be equally alert at all times, and there may be benefits to the pod as a whole when animals remain loosely synchronized. Safety in numbers matters in the ocean just as it does on land. One animal partly aware is useful. Several animals partly aware in a coordinated group are better. It is not hard to see how such systems could be favoured. The sea is big, but threats can arrive quickly, and remaining together reduces confusion. Humans sometimes imagine intelligence leading to convenience. We think a clever animal must have found a way around the old biological inconveniences. Yet in many cases, intelligence simply means handling the inconveniences more effectively. Dolphins are a good example. They are smart, yes, but their cleverness did not exempt them from the need to sleep, breathe, avoid predators, raise young, and stay with the group. It only helped them navigate those pressures more successfully. Their sleep is not simple, because their world is not simple. One could even argue that sleeping with one eye open is one of the clearest examples of what life in the ocean does to familiar needs. It does not remove them, it sharpens them, then forces adaptation around them. Sleep remains essential. Awareness remains essential too. So the nervous system splits the difference. That may be the best way to read many marine behaviours. They are not odd flourishes. They are exact responses to exact demands. There is a strange comfort in that. though perhaps not the kind that helps you nod off instantly. It is more the comfort of seeing that life can solve hard problems without drama, not by complaining, not by demanding ideal conditions, but by adjusting the design. One eye open, one hemisphere resting, one part breathing, one part watching. It is an arrangement so practical that it begins to seem obvious once you hear it, which is usually the sign of a very good evolutionary solution. And once you accept that one side of the brain can rest while the other keeps the body going, the next idea follows almost automatically, because sleeping with one eye open is really just the visible surface of a deeper system, one in which rest is divided, shared out, and handled in turns, and that means to understand it properly, we have to move from the eye to the brain itself, where the real balancing act is happening. Once you get past the first surprise that some ocean animals can rest with one eye open, the next surprise is even stranger, because the open eye is only the visible part of a deeper arrangement. The real trick is happening inside the skull. In certain marine mammals, rest is not something the whole brain does together. It is something the brain divides up, shares out, and handles in shifts. One half slows down into a sleep state, while the other half stays active enough to keep the body moving, breathing, and aware of the world. Later, they switch. It is a system so unusual by human standards that it sounds almost made up the first time you hear it. But for animals that live in water and breathe air, it makes practical sense in a way that our style of sleep simply would not. Humans are used to sleep feeling unified. You go to bed as one person, and barring the occasional strange dream or a pillow dispute, you tend to sleep as one person too. The whole brain moves through stages together. You do not generally send the left side off duty at midnight and the right side at 3 a.m. That would be a useful feature during tax season, but it is not how we are built. Our sleep depends on trust. We trust the body to keep breathing automatically. We trust the bed to remain where it is. We trust the walls, the roof, and the general lack of sharks in the hallway. Because of that, full sleep is possible. In the sea, for certain animals, that kind of full sleep would be dangerously impractical. Dolphins are the clearest example, and they deserve it, because they have done more than perhaps any other marine animal to force humans to admit that our version of sleep is not the default setting for life. A dolphin breathes air, but it lives in water. That means it cannot simply drop into deep, total unconsciousness for hours at a time, and hope instinct sorts the rest out. Each breath must be taken intentionally by surfacing. The body cannot be trusted to do that on autopilot in the same way ours can while we're asleep. So the nervous system solves the problem by keeping one hemisphere of the brain awake enough to manage the essentials while the other hemisphere rests. This is called unihemispheric slow-wave sleep, which is a long term for a very direct idea. Unihemispheric means one hemisphere at a time. Slow wave refers to the kind of brain activity associated with deep sleep. Put those together, and what you get is one side sleeping while the other side remains more alert. It is not a half-hearted nap. It is a carefully organised shift system. One side of the brain handles the job of staying alive in a medium where forgetting to breathe would be a serious mistake. The other side gets restoration. Then later they trade places. There is something almost absurdly sensible about it. If both halves cannot safely go offline together, then they stop trying. Nature does not waste time being offended by the loss of elegance. It simply takes the old model apart and keeps the parts that still work. For dolphins, this means reduced activity, one open eye, slow movement, regular surfacing, and a brain that refuses to insist on doing everything at once. It is sleep redesigned around the fact that the animal lives in water but still answers to lungs. That last point matters because it is easy to underestimate how much a single body feature can reshape the entire problem of rest. If dolphins had gills, their sleep would almost certainly look very different. If humans had to wake enough to breathe on purpose every few minutes throughout the night, our bedrooms would become places of much lower confidence. But dolphins do not have gills, and neither do whales or porpoises. They are mammals that return to the water while keeping the old air-breathing arrangement. That evolutionary history left them with extraordinary bodies, but it also left them with a logistical challenge that never really goes away. Rest must fit around breathing, not the other way around. And breathing is only the first part. Awareness matters too. A dolphin in the open sea cannot become entirely absent from the world for long stretches. It needs to maintain some orientation. It may need to remain loosely coordinated with its pod. It may need to stay responsive to sounds, currents, obstacles, changes in movement or threats. Full unconsciousness would cost too much. Partial unconsciousness, divided intelligently across time, is the better bargain. It gives the brain a way to recover without leaving the body completely undefended. From a human point of view, this sounds exhausting. That is partly because we imagine it using our own standards. We hear half a brain at a time and think of a miserable compromise, like only charging half your phone and hoping optimism will cover the rest. But for the animals involved, it is not a clumsy backup plan. It is the plan. Their nervous systems are built to use it. What feels incomplete to us is complete enough for them. That is one of the more useful corrections the ocean keeps offering. Not every solution has to look comfortable from a human sofa to count as an elegant biological design. It also helps to understand that awake and asleep are not always all or nothing states, even in humans. Our own brains move through different stages. Some parts are more active at some times than others. Sleep is already more layered than it feels from the inside. Dolphins simply make that layered quality much more obvious by dividing it across hemispheres in a way we can actually describe. One side shows the electrical signs of slow-wave sleep. The other stays more active. Then later, the pattern reverses. Rather than shutting the whole house down, they close one wing and keep the lights on in the other. Whales appear to use related strategies, though exact patterns vary by species, and much remains difficult to study because very large marine mammals are not always enthusiastic about volunteering for lab work. Still, the same broad issue applies. Air breathing in water demands a style of rest that preserves control. This is one reason large cetaceans often rest in ways that look subdued rather than fully collapsed. Slow swimming, floating, quiet surfacing, group coordination. These all fit a body that needs restoration but cannot abandon management. One of the most interesting parts of this arrangement is what it says about the purpose of sleep. If an animal can sleep one hemisphere at a time, that tells us something important. It suggests that at least some of the restorative functions of sleep can be delivered locally or regionally, rather than only by shutting everything down together. That is a fascinating idea because it shifts the question from does the whole animal sleep to which parts are resting and how much. In marine mammals with unihemispheric sleep, the body is not either awake or asleep in a simple single sense. It is both at once, depending on where you look. That should not be surprising, really. The brain is not one smooth, featureless thing. It is a system of systems. If one part can continue handling breathing, posture, and basic monitoring while another part enters slow-wave sleep, then sleep itself begins to look less like a single curtain coming down, and more like maintenance work being scheduled room by room. Humans do not usually experience it that way, but the ocean keeps demonstrating that the same core need can be organised very differently. There is also a social benefit to this kind of arrangement. Dolphins are not solitary sleepers in isolated underwater bedrooms. They often remain in groups, and group life depends on continued coordination. Resting together while maintaining enough awareness to keep the pod loosely organised is a major advantage. An animal that can stay near companions, respond when needed, and still get meaningful rest has a better chance of avoiding separation, confusion, or unnecessary risk. For calves, this matters even more. A young dolphin needs contact, protection, and frequent surfacing. A sleeping system that preserves some awareness is not just useful. It is part of how the species manages its earliest vulnerable stage. In fact, mother-calf pairs in dolphins show some of the most striking evidence that marine rest does not always resemble the mammalian image we carry in our heads. Early after birth, both mother and calf may remain continuously active for long periods, with very little of the quiet surface resting one might expect. That sounds brutal, and by human standards it probably is. But again, the context matters. The calf must surface to breathe, the mother must stay close, moving, monitoring and guiding. In water, birth does not come with a guaranteed pause. The world keeps moving, so they do too. Sleep and rest, when they occur, are threaded into activity rather than clearly separated from it. All of this raises an obvious question. Does half-brain sleep provide all the same benefits as full-brain sleep? The answer is that we do not know every detail, and different species may manage different trade-offs. What matters for the script, and what matters scientifically, is that this system clearly provides enough restoration for these animals to function, survive, hunt, navigate, socialize, and reproduce. That alone tells you it is not a flimsy emergency measure. It is a stable, long-term solution. Evolution does not preserve expensive nervous system arrangements just because they are interesting to documentaries. It preserves what works, and it works well enough that similar ideas show up outside cetaceans too. Some seals can exhibit unihemispheric sleep, especially when in water. On land, those same animals may sleep in a much more ordinary bilateral fashion, with both hemispheres participating more fully. That contrast is one of the most revealing things in the whole subject. Put the animal on shore, and it can afford a more familiar mammalian sleep. Put it in water, and the sleep pattern becomes more cautious, more divided, more marine. That tells you the environment is not a small detail. It is shaping the architecture of rest in real time. Birds offer another parallel. Some species can sleep unihemispherically as well, especially when exposed to danger or when resting in awkward conditions. A bird on the edge of a flock may keep the eye facing outward open while the inward-facing eye closes. The exposed hemisphere stays more alert, the safer side rests more deeply. That does not make birds ocean creatures, obviously, but it reinforces the main point. When vulnerability is high, the brain can divide responsibilities. Rest does not always require everyone to leave the room together. What makes marine mammals especially dramatic examples is that their division of labour is tied not just to danger, but to life support. Humans can sleep through quite a lot because the body handles the basics. A dolphin cannot trust the same depth of disengagement. It must continue to breathe deliberately. This means the sleeping hemisphere is not simply dozing while the other listens for trouble. The wakeful hemisphere is handling core body management. It is the difference between a security guard and the person keeping the building's oxygen supply turned on. There is a tendency, when discussing animals with remarkable abilities, to turn them into symbols of ease. Dolphins become cheerful geniuses. Whales become majestic calm. Sharks become pure focus. But biology is usually less tidy than our symbolism. Half-brain sleep is a reminder of that. It is not glamorous. It is practical. It says that the ocean does not hand out convenient conditions just because an animal is intelligent or impressive. Even a highly social, capable marine mammal must still solve basic mechanical problems in order to survive the night. It is also worth noticing that half a brain at a time does not mean a clean 50-50 split in some cartoonish sense. The brain is more complex than that, and the exact pattern of activation and rest is not identical to putting one side in a locked room while the other attends meetings. But as a broad description, it captures something crucial. Rest is asymmetrical. The animal is neurologically divided between restoration and vigilance. That division shows up in behaviour, eye use, responsiveness, and movement. It is real enough to measure and important enough to define how these animals live. Humans sometimes experience small hints of local sleep pressure in our own brains. Under extreme sleep deprivation, parts of the brain may show micro-sleep-like behaviour, even while the person remains technically awake. This is not the same as healthy unihemispheric sleep, but it is a reminder that the nervous system does not always operate as one simple block. Fatigue can accumulate locally. Functions can degrade unevenly. The marine mammal version is far more orderly, of course. It is an evolved, controlled pattern, not your brain quietly resigning during an afternoon meeting. Still, the comparison helps underline the basic idea that rest need not always arrive as one unified event. Another thing half-brain sleep changes is the sense of vulnerability. In human sleep, once you're deeply asleep, your awareness of time and space narrows sharply. Hours can pass in an instant. The room disappears. A dolphin cannot afford that same full disconnection. Some thread of continuity with the environment must remain. Breathing, surfacing, pod position, water movement, all of these still matter. That continuity likely means the subjective quality of rest, if one can even use that phrase carefully about another species, is very different from ours. It is less like vanishing for a while, and more like dimming in alternating sections. That may sound less satisfying than our version, but it is dangerous to assume so. Satisfaction is not the point. Function is. We like to imagine the best sleep as a kind of total surrender, because that is what suits us. A species shaped by marine life may have no use for that ideal. Its best sleep is the sleep that restores enough without interrupting the jobs that cannot be interrupted. There is no universal gold standard. There are only bodies in environments, negotiating the terms. It also says something broader about evolution and compromise. Humans sometimes talk as though adaptation always means improvement in one simple direction. Faster, smarter, stronger, better. But real adaptation is often more like careful budgeting. You keep what you need, modify what you can, and accept that every choice has costs. Dolphins kept lungs instead of evolving gills. That came with advantages and with ongoing demands. Half-brain sleep is part of how those demands are managed. It is not perfection. It is successful compromise, which is often what evolution looks like when you stop expecting theatrical neatness. And then there is the odd emotional effect this topic has on people. The first reaction is usually amazement. The second is often a strange sympathy. Half the brain resting, half the brain working. One eye open, slow movement, constant responsibility. It sounds, to many humans, suspiciously like a life stage rather than an animal adaptation. New parents, light sleepers, anxious travellers, people with too much on their minds, all of them hear something familiar in it. That familiarity is useful in moderation, but one should not overdo it. Dolphins are not basically us with more streamlined bodies and better sonar. They are solving their own problem in their own way. The resemblance is only partial. Still, it is hard not to admire the straightforward brilliance of it. The ocean says, "You may rest, but you may not disappear." The brain replies, "Fine, then I will rest in sections." That is the entire logic. No drama, no wasted motion, no insistence that the old land mammal rulebook must apply unchanged just because it once worked elsewhere. If the conditions make full bilateral sleep unsafe, the brain becomes a shift schedule. One half handles the boring but critical tasks. The other gets the deep quiet it needs. Then they reverse, and the more you look at this system, the more it becomes clear that it is not a side note in marine biology. It is one of the clearest demonstrations that sleep is far more flexible than humans once assumed. Rest can be divided. Awareness can be preserved. The body can remain in motion while part of the brain enters a sleep state. Life can protect a fundamental need without expressing it in the familiar form of bedtime, darkness, closed eyes, and total surrender. The need remains. The design changes. That is really the lesson beneath the strangeness. Half-brain sleep is not weird for the sake of being weird. It is what happens when a body cannot safely stop doing everything at once. The ocean is full of these edits to familiar life processes. Rest is trimmed, split, disguised, delayed, or distributed, but it is not abandoned. If anything, the complexity proves how necessary it is. Creatures will go to astonishing lengths to keep some form of sleep in their lives. They will sleep in motion, sleep in hiding, sleep one hemisphere at a time, sleep while surfacing, sleep while staying with the group. The body insists, and evolution gets creative. From there, another practical question follows naturally, because once you accept that some marine animals can divide rest across the brain, you start noticing that the body itself must also cope with a basic underwater difficulty humans never face in bed, which is that a resting creature still has to deal with buoyancy, balance, and not drifting into a worse situation than the one it started with. And that makes the next problem less about the brain and more about the body and water, because resting is one thing, but resting without sinking, floating away, or losing control of your place in the sea is a challenge all its own. If resting on land is mostly a matter of finding a surface and trusting it to stay put, resting in the ocean adds a rather annoying extra requirement. You need to remain where you mean to be. That sounds simple until you remember that water is not still, gravity is still involved, and your body may be naturally inclined to sink, float, drift, roll, or be nudged somewhere unhelpful while you're trying to do the aquatic equivalent of turning in for the night. For ocean creatures, sleep is never only about the brain. It is also about position. It is about balance. It is about not waking up, if waking up is even the right word, halfway across the neighbourhood because a current decided you looked movable. Humans do not spend much time thinking about this because our sleeping arrangements are deeply spoiled. A bed is a remarkable thing when you think about it. You climb onto it, gravity presses you down in a predictable way. Unless your evening has gone extraordinarily badly, you remain in more or less the same place until morning. Even if you toss and turn, you're still on a surface designed to keep you from wandering into the hedge at 3 a.m. Ocean creatures do not get that luxury. Their world is a moving volume, not a stable platform. If they are going to rest, they must solve the problem of staying in the right part of that volume. This starts with buoyancy, which is one of those physical facts that sounds dry until you realise half the ocean is quietly negotiating with it all the time. A creature in water is never just existing there in a neutral state. Its body density, shape, gas spaces, fat content, movement, and the salinity of the surrounding water all affect whether it tends to rise, sink, hover, or require effort to remain level. That means resting is not as simple as becoming inactive. In some cases, inactivity would cause the animal to drift upward. In others, it would make the animal sink. In others still, it would leave the animal at the mercy of currents that are perfectly happy to rearrange the furniture. Fish handle this in a variety of ways, and one of the most useful tools available to many bony fish is the swim bladder. This gas-filled organ helps control buoyancy. By adjusting the amount of gas in it, a fish can maintain neutral buoyancy, meaning it neither sinks nor floats uncontrollably. During active life, that is enormously helpful, because it reduces the amount of constant swimming effort needed to hold position in the water. At rest, it matters just as much. A fish with well-managed buoyancy can hover or settle with minimal motion, which makes quiet nighttime behaviour possible, without constantly spending energy, just to avoid drifting nose first into the seabed or bobbing upward like a confused party decoration. There is something very tidy about that arrangement. The fish does not need a mattress, it needs fine control over lift. Once that is in place, sleep or sleep-like rest becomes more practical. A reef fish can tuck itself into a protected spot and use only tiny fin adjustments to remain stable. A fish out in more open water can reduce activity without immediately losing depth control. It is the marine version of having a chair that does not slide away when you try to sit in it. Not glamorous, but very useful. Of course, not all fish have swim bladders, and that is where life starts getting more inventive. Sharks, for instance, do not use swim bladders. Instead, buoyancy comes partly from a large oil-rich liver and partly from lift generated by movement and body shape. That works very well for an active animal designed to move efficiently through the water. It becomes more complicated when rest enters the picture. Some sharks, especially those adapted to lying on the bottom or staying relatively still in caves or on the seafloor, can manage just fine. Others, particularly species built for continuous swimming, face a more awkward situation. Stop too much, and the body may lose the lift or water flow it depends on. So rest becomes a question not just of slowing down, but of slowing down without surrendering the mechanics that keep everything functioning. This is one reason the old idea that some sharks must keep swimming or die became so memorable. Like many memorable claims, it is a little too neat. Some sharks do need continuous or near continuous movement to maintain effective water flow over the gills and proper control in the water. Others can rest more directly. The larger point, though, is that for any shark whose body depends heavily on forward motion, nighttime rest cannot involve simply sinking into a fully still state and hoping for the best. It has to involve controlled, reduced movement. The body remains in operation. The ocean does not allow a full parking mode. That same basic issue appears in very different forms across marine life. Tunas are built like dedicated athletes with no interest in idling for long. Their bodies are streamlined for constant swimming, and their style of rest reflects that reality. They can reduce activity, alter pace, and move more quietly, but they are not creatures of leisurely immobility. Compare that with a bottom-dwelling ray partially covered in sand, and you are looking at two very different solutions to the same larger problem. One remains supported by motion and body design. The other uses the seafloor itself as a resting platform. Both work because both match the animal's structure. The seafloor, in fact, is one of the great gifts of the ocean to any creature that can use it. While open water poses constant problems of suspension and drift, the bottom offers contact. A fish can rest against it. A shark can lie on it. A turtle can wedge itself near it. A ray can settle into it. Sand, mud, rock, coral and seagrass each offer different possibilities. From the point of view of a tired marine animal, the bottom is less a single place and more a menu. Do you need camouflage? Choose sand. Do you need shelter? Find a ledge. Do you need a crack that matches your body? Head for the reef. Do you need somewhere the current weakens a bit? Tuck in behind structure. It is not a bedroom, but it is a workable real estate market. Sea turtles are a good example of how useful a solid reference point can be. They breathe air, but they can stay underwater for long periods, especially while resting. When it is time to settle down, many find protected locations under ledges, in reef crevices, or on the seabed. There, buoyancy and body position can be managed with much less effort than in open water. The turtle is not fighting to stay suspended in the middle of the water column. It has chosen a spot where the body can rest against something real. That contact reduces the amount of correction needed. It also reduces drift, lowers exposure, and lets the animal remain in a stable posture until it eventually surfaces to breathe again. And that word, posture, matters more underwater than we tend to notice at first. On land, posture during sleep is something we associate with comfort, joint support, perhaps the vague hope of waking without a neck complaint. In the ocean, posture is also about hydrodynamics and control. A badly chosen position may expose the body to current, increase drift, or make fast escape more difficult if needed. So marine animals often adopt resting postures that are efficient rather than sentimental. A fish angles itself just so inside coral. A seahorse anchors with its tail. A turtle wedges under structure. A ray flattens into the seabed. A shark aligns with water flow. These are not random ways of being still. They are positions that make stillness possible. Seahorses, in their own quiet way, are particularly good at illustrating this. They are not strong continuous swimmers like tuna, and they live in habitats where being swept away is not a charming adventure. So they use prehensile tails to grip seagrass, coral, or other structure. That anchoring becomes especially helpful during rest. Rather than trust the water to behave, the seahorse attaches itself to the environment and lets the body remain in place. There is something wonderfully direct about that. If floating freely is too risky, simply hold on to something. Humans do this too, of course, though usually on buses rather than in eelgrass. Sea otters take a similarly practical approach at the surface. They sleep floating on their backs, which sounds unreasonably pleasant right up until you remember the ocean likes moving things around. To avoid drifting away, otters may wrap themselves in kelp or rest in groups that remain in contact. The kelp acts as an anchor, the group acts as insurance. Without that sort of strategy, a sleeping otter could wake up far from where it meant to be, which is inconvenient if you are an otter, and deeply inconvenient if you are an otter pup. The fact that kelp forests can function as giant marine safety straps is one of those details that makes the sea seem at once very dangerous and oddly resourceful. Surface sleeping itself is an interesting problem, because the surface is not nearly as stable as it appears from shore. It is an interface, constantly being shaped by wind, waves, and swell. A body floating there is supported, yes, but not fixed. It can roll, separate from companions, or be carried along. Marine mammals that use the surface for rest often have body designs and behaviours that help manage this. Some float quietly, some remain in loose formation, some take short rest periods rather than long ones. In every case, the body's working with water rather than pretending water is a bed. Even animals that look as though they should have no trouble floating often need to manage vertical position with care. Jellyfish drift, but not always passively. Many can pulse upward or downward and adjust where they sit in the water. During quieter periods, activity may decrease, but the body is still part of a moving system. Tiny changes in pulsing can alter depth. That matters because depth changes temperature, light, predator exposure, and access to food. Not sinking is not always the goal. Sometimes the goal is not sinking too far, not rising too much, and not ending up in a place where the rest state becomes more expensive than it is worth. The same can be said for countless small fish and larvae in the water column. To us, they may seem to float almost by accident. In reality, even maintaining a rough vertical zone can require ongoing adjustments. Body fat, gas, fin motion, and behaviour all contribute. During nighttime rest or reduced activity, these creatures often shift to safer depths, calmer microhabitats, or positions where remaining in place costs less. The sea may be vast, but animals live it locally. A difference of a few feet can matter. A bit more shelter, a bit less light, a slightly weaker current that is often enough to turn an exposed spot into a workable resting place. Then there are creatures that deal with sinking not by preventing it, but by using it. Burying fish, rays, and some invertebrates treat the substrate almost like a blanket and a support frame combined. A fish that slips into sand is not failing to stay afloat. It is choosing the bottom as the safest place to stop negotiating with the water column. Once buried or partially buried, the body gains concealment and positional stability at the same time. It no longer has to hover, correct, or fight drift. The environment holds it. That is a wonderful bargain if you're built for it. Cuttlefish and octopuses, though very different from one another and from fish, also show how important it is to choose a place where the body does not need constant correction. An octopus in a den can relax into the shape of the space. A cuttlefish may settle close to the substrate and reduce active movement. These are intelligent animals, but their intelligence does not spare them from physics. If anything, it gives them more ways to work with it. A den is not only a shelter from predators, it is a place where the body can stop managing three-dimensional exposure every second. Wolves matter underwater too, just in different forms. Currents are the other half of this story, and they deserve more respect than they usually get in casual discussions of marine life. Water is always moving somewhere. Even in places that seem calm, there may be subtle flow, surge, or tidal shift. A creature trying to rest must either resist that movement, hide from it, use it, or anchor against it. Small fish often choose reef pockets where the current is reduced. Larger animals may align themselves with flow so the body experiences less drag. Bottom dwellers use the seabed. Kelp dwellers use vegetation. Open water swimmers reduce speed but keep enough control to avoid being turned into drift material. It is worth noting that floating through the night is often less about literal floating and more about preventing the environment from making decisions on your behalf. In that sense, control is the true theme. Can the animal remain at the right depth? Can it avoid being rolled or swept? Can it keep near the group? Can it maintain breathing access? Can it escape quickly if necessary? Rest is only possible when those questions have acceptable answers. So the marine body does not just sleep, it manages position while sleeping. One of the reasons this becomes so interesting is that humans rarely need to think about sleep as a problem of fluid mechanics. We may worry about pillows, temperature, or mattress firmness, but almost never about lift, drag, anchoring, or neutral buoyancy. Marine animals do. Their version of bedtime includes decisions about whether the body will remain in the right vertical zone and what happens if it does not. That sounds technical, but for the animal it is ordinary life. The physics of water is not a separate chapter from biology. It is the setting inside which biology must function every minute. And because it must function every minute, many of these solutions are economical. No creature wants to spend more energy than necessary just to remain in a sleep position. Energy saved at night can be used for feeding, migration, reproduction, or simply surviving a lean period later. So natural selection tends to favour resting strategies that are safe without being costly. Neutral buoyancy, anchoring, wedging, burying, aligning with flow, choosing sheltered spots, all of these reduce the amount of active correction needed. They let the body quiet down without immediately creating a new problem. That economy is one reason even slight body features matter. A broad flat underside helps a ray settle. An oil-rich liver helps a shark avoid sinking too hard. A swim bladder helps a fish hover. A prehensile tail helps a seahorse hold position. A heavy shell shapes how some animals rest on the bottom. Fat distribution changes floating in marine mammals. Flippers, fins, tail shapes, and body angles all influence what sort of nighttime posture is realistic. Nothing exists in isolation. A sleeping style is always connected to anatomy. It is also connected to habitat in a very practical way. Reef animals can use structure. Open ocean animals rely more on body mechanics and movement. Coastal species may use vegetation or shallow bottom features. Deep-sea animals face different buoyancy and pressure conditions altogether. So, how do they avoid sinking does not have one answer any more than where do people sleep has one answer. Beds, hammocks, bunks, couches, airport chairs of questionable dignity all count. The sea has its own version of that variety, only colder and with more teeth nearby. Still, what remains consistent is that rest underwater depends on staying in the right place with the least necessary effort. That may mean floating neutrally, bracing against the bottom, locking into kelp, slowing but not stopping, or choosing a shelter that takes some of the work away. Sleep in the ocean is never just something happening inside the nervous system. It is something the whole body negotiates with physics. And once you start seeing that, another layer of the story comes into focus, because not every creature merely holds position while resting. Some actively prepare for it. Some build little forms of protection, choose special spots, or even surround themselves with strange nighttime defences, which means the next step is not just about staying afloat or staying put, but about the surprisingly inventive places and methods ocean creatures use when it is finally time to settle in. Once you understand that ocean creatures cannot treat sleep the way we do, and once you see how much effort goes into simply staying in place through a period of rest, the next thing that becomes obvious is that many of them do not leave bedtime arrangements to chance. They may not have beds in the human sense, but they do have preferred spots, nighttime routines, and, in some cases, what can only be described as highly specialised sleeping gear. Not gear they bought, obviously. No fish is out there comparing product reviews or complaining about thread count, but they do make use of very specific structures and behaviours that serve some of the same basic purposes our own sleep setups do. They create protection, they reduce disturbance, they lower risk, they help the body get through a vulnerable stretch of time with as little trouble as possible. That is one of the great pleasures of looking closely at reef life in particular. During the day, the reef seems almost too busy to imagine anyone getting any rest at all. Fish are darting between coral heads, picking at algae, cleaning one another, defending patches of territory, avoiding being eaten, trying to eat something else, and generally behaving like a city that never entirely trusts silence. But when the light begins to fade, that same reef changes character. The daytime residents start choosing places to settle. Some disappear into cracks, some wedge between coral branches, some tuck under ledges, some vanish into sand. Others coat themselves in a layer of mucus that sounds ridiculous until you remember how many creatures in the sea are trying to sniff them out. It is not one bedtime ritual. It is a whole collection of them, each shaped by body type, neighbourhood, and the specific sort of trouble likely to arrive after dark. A coral reef, for all its beauty, is not a gentle sleeping environment. It is crowded, complex, and full of residents that are active on different schedules. The fish that wants to rest cannot assume the entire area is winding down in a polite communal spirit. In fact, the opposite is often true. As many day-active animals settle, night-active hunters begin their shift. Moray eels emerge. Predatory fish change their routes. Crustaceans become more active. Small creatures leave hiding places to feed. The reef is not closing. It is rotating staff. That means any daytime fish looking for nighttime safety has to choose its resting place with real care. This is where coral branches, crevices, and overhangs become something like reef furniture. A fish does not need softness. It needs shape. It needs a space that matches its body closely enough to reduce exposure and make it difficult for a predator to get a clean angle. Small wrasses, damselfish, butterfly fish, and many others often return to particular hiding places at night. These are not random last-minute choices. In many cases, the fish seems to know exactly where it intends to go. It reaches the same shelter, fits itself into the same kind of narrow spot, and remains there through the risky hours of darkness. The reef becomes a map of trusted bedrooms, except these bedrooms are made of living coral, rough stone, or narrow gaps, and the consequences of choosing badly are substantially worse than a stiff neck. The advantage of a reef bed, if one can call it that, is simple. The surrounding structure does some of the work. It breaks up the fish's outline, it limits water movement, it reduces the number of directions from which an attack can come. It may also make the animal less obvious to anything scanning the reef with vision, smell, or lateral line detection. A fish resting out in the open is an invitation. A fish tucked deep into branching coral is an inconvenience. In biology, inconvenience can be enough. Predators do not need an impossible target. They just need a less appealing one than the fish next door. Some reef fish go further than simply disappearing into structure. They change colour at night. This is one of those details that sounds decorative until you remember that colour is often about function. Bright day patterns may be useful for communication, species recognition, courtship, or territorial display, but they are not always ideal if your current goal is to be overlooked by anything with teeth. So a fish that is vivid under sunlight may become paler, blotchier, or duller after dark. It is the underwater equivalent of switching from a loud jacket to practical camouflage as soon as the streets get quiet. The fish is still there, still resting, but the visual message has changed. During the day, "look at me" may be useful. At night, that is probably just part of the reef is much better. Then there are the species that decide the safest place to spend the night is not within the reef, but under it, or rather under its nearest layer of sand. Sand is one of the ocean's most practical materials. It is everywhere in shallow marine habitats. It conforms to the body. It conceals. It softens visual outline. It can even buffer small disturbances in water flow. So for some fish, especially wrasses and related species, bedtime means diving straight into the substrate and vanishing. If you were watching during the day, you might think that fish had simply ceased to exist. It has not. It is buried, quiet, and much less detectable. There is something deeply sensible about using the seafloor as a blanket. A fish in sand does not have to hover. It does not have to remain half exposed near coral. It does not have to trust that every passing predator is feeling selective. The sand covers the body, dampens the outline, and creates a physical barrier, however modest, between the fish and the surrounding world. It is not impenetrable. Nothing in the sea really is, but it is enough to reduce risk, and that is what matters. Ocean creatures rarely aim for perfect safety because perfect safety is not generally on offer. They aim for better odds. Rays use the same principle in their own way. A stingray resting on the bottom may flap some sand over itself until only the eyes and spiracles remain visible. The body disappears into the substrate. What had been a clearly defined animal becomes a shape the environment struggles to explain. This is useful for avoiding predators, useful for ambush hunting, and useful for quiet rest. Again, the seabed acts not just as location but as equipment. The animal has not brought a blanket. It has become one with the nearest available material, which in a predatory environment is a very reasonable design decision. Flatfish take this even further. Their entire body plan is built around lying against the bottom. One side of the body is pressed into the substrate. Both eyes end up on the upward-facing side, and camouflage patterns make the outline hard to detect. A flatfish resting on the seabed does not merely lie down. It completes a disguise. During quiet periods, it can remain astonishingly hard to see, which means it can rest with a lower risk of being noticed. Flatfish are, in a sense, permanently dressed for an afternoon nap that might turn into a hunting opportunity if something careless passes by. It is one of nature's most efficient combinations of laziness and preparedness, though calling it laziness would be unfair. A body built to disappear is not idle. It is economical. If sand serves as one kind of nighttime protection, mucus serves as another, and this is where marine life begins to look delightfully absurd without becoming any less practical. Parrotfish are the stars of this particular scene. During the day, they are busy reef grazers, scraping algae and bits of material from coral with beak-like mouths. At night, some species do something that would sound invented if people had not repeatedly observed it. They secrete a mucus cocoon around themselves. That sentence alone tends to stop people for a moment, mostly because it sounds less like zoology and more like a very specific children's bedtime story written by someone with unusual ideas about comfort. But the cocoon is real, and its likely function is not comfort at all. Scientists think it may help reduce the chemical signals that predators and parasites could use to find the fish. In other words, it may serve as a kind of scent masking layer. The fish settles into a reef shelter, releases this transparent envelope, and spends the night inside it like an underwater tenant with very particular privacy concerns. The mucus cocoon is a perfect example of how marine sleep behaviour can look comical to us while being entirely serious from the animal's point of view. Humans associate bedtime gear with softness, warmth, maybe insulation. Parrotfish are using slime as an anti-detection measure. No one is trying to make this look cosy. The cocoon may not even be especially comfortable in any sense that matters to us. That is not the point. The point is to reduce the chance of being found while the animal is less responsive and less able to flee instantly. If slime helps with that, slime it is. Cleaner wrasses and some other species also produce mucus at night, though not always as dramatically. Many fish coat their bodies in mucus all the time to some extent, as part of normal skin protection, but nighttime mucus use can become more specialised. In certain cases it may help with scent masking, parasite defence, or reducing irritation, while resting in close contact with the substrate or reef structure. It is one of those invisible details that makes the night shift of reef life much stranger than it appears from the surface. Beneath the dark water, small animals are wedging themselves into holes, dimming their colours, slowing their metabolism, and in some cases wrapping themselves in a secretion-based privacy screen. If nothing else, it should make us less confident about calling human bedtime routines peculiar. Octopuses naturally approach the whole matter with more personality. They do not bury themselves in mucus cocoons or wedge into coral branches in quite the same way because they do not need to. They are soft-bodied, highly flexible, and extremely good at turning holes into secure apartments. A reef or rocky habitat provides all sorts of den options for an octopus. A narrow crevice, an abandoned shell, a hole beneath stone, any of these can become a sleeping place. And because octopuses are not casual about shelter, they often modify the area. They may gather shells, pebbles, or bits of debris near the entrance. This can serve as camouflage, reinforcement, or simply a way of managing the opening so it feels safer. It is tempting to describe this as decorating, but that would be misleading and a little rude. An octopus is not trying to make the den cute, it is making it defensible. Still, the effect is striking. Here is an animal with no rigid skeleton, living in a dangerous environment, using available objects to improve its sleeping space. It does not build a bed. It builds a better threshold. That says a lot about what rest means in the sea. Safety comes first. Comfort, if it exists at all, is mostly the comfort of reduced exposure. Cuttlefish and squid are less attached to dens, but they too show changes in body pattern and posture during rest. A cuttlefish can settle close to the bottom, shift its colour, and become much less conspicuous. It does not need a crevice if it can make its whole body less noticeable against the background. Some cephalopods appear to cycle through quieter and more active sleep-like periods, during which colour patterns may flicker and body movements may change. The resting place matters, but so does what the body itself can do to lower risk. In a sense, their pyjamas are not external at all. They are built into the skin. Seahorses with their prehensile tails use habitat in an entirely different way. They do not rest by hiding under blankets of sand or inside slime bubbles. Instead, they anchor themselves to seagrass, coral, or other holdfasts. Once attached, they are less likely to drift away while inactive. In seagrass beds, this becomes especially effective. The animal's body can sway with the vegetation, its outline already strange enough to resemble the surroundings. The grass itself becomes bed frame, wall, and camouflage all at once. A seahorse sleeping among vertical blades of seagrass is not concealed in the dramatic sense of a buried fish, but it is secure in another way. It belongs to the shape of the place. Kelp forests provide something similar for other animals. Sea otters famously wrap themselves in kelp while sleeping, so they do not drift away. It is one of the few marine bedtime habits that people instantly read as adorable, which is fair, but it is also a good example of using habitat as sleep equipment. The kelp is not scenery, it is a restraint system. In a moving ocean, that matters. A sleeping otter without some sort of anchor could wake far from where it settled. A sleeping otter with kelp stays put. Very little in marine life is complicated once you state the actual problem clearly. Reef caves and overhangs deserve more respect in this story too. For many fish, lobsters and eels, these areas become shared nighttime districts. One can almost imagine the reef after dark as a building whose daytime offices have emptied and whose hidden sleeping quarters have quietly filled. Moray eels remain tucked more deeply inside holes during rest periods. Lobsters retreat into cracks. Soldierfish and squirrelfish, which often shelter by day and feed by night, reverse the rhythm, but the principle is the same. Structure allows stillness. The more three-dimensional the habitat, the more options animals have for finding a niche that reduces movement and visibility. That is one reason degraded reefs can be such a problem. It is not only that animals lose feeding grounds or breeding sites, they lose bedrooms, they lose the tiny gaps, branches, ledges and protective forms that make rest safer. A reef flattened by damage is not just less beautiful, it is less habitable across the entire daily cycle. An animal that once had a reliable sleeping place may be pushed into more exposed rest, and exposed rest is poor rest. The body may remain more alert, spend more energy, or suffer higher predation risk. Sleep ecology is tied directly to habitat quality. even if that phrase sounds much less dramatic than what it means in practice. And habitat quality matters for sandy sleepers too. Fine sediment, seagrass cover, rubble, coral complexity, all of these affect where and how animals can settle. A fish adapted to bury itself in clean sand cannot use bare rock the same way. A species that depends on branching, coral, cannot simply switch to a flat bottom and expect things to go well. The bedtime arrangement is species-specific because the whole animal is species-specific. It has the body it has, the habits it has, and the defences it has. When those match the environment, nighttime becomes manageable. When they do not, it becomes expensive. This is also why so many marine resting behaviours look repetitive. The same fish returning night after night to the same crevice is not being unimaginative. It is using a location that has already proved acceptable. Repeated use of the same sleeping spot saves time, reduces uncertainty, and probably lowers stress. The animal does not need to evaluate the whole reef from scratch every evening like a traveller trying to find a hotel in a city with poor signage. It already knows where to go. That predictability matters. In a hazardous environment, good routines are valuable. Humans are not so different in that respect. We like familiar beds, familiar corners, familiar blankets, familiar little arrangements that make rest easier. The difference is mostly that our versions involve fabric and furniture rather than coral branches and strategic mucus. The underlying logic is recognisable. A good sleeping place reduces disturbance. It lowers vigilance. It makes the body more willing to let go a little. That is true whether you are a person in a quiet room, a rassie under sand, an octopus in a den, or a parrotfish inside a slime cocoon that no interior designer would ever defend. And that brings us to one of the most useful corrections marine life offers. Sleep is not a single state switched on in isolation from the world. It is a relationship between the body and the place where the body tries to become less active. Reef beds, sand blankets, mucus layers, dens, kelp anchors, all of these are part of the process. They do not merely surround sleep, they make it possible. The body rests because the environment, or a carefully chosen piece of it, has been turned into support. From there, though, the story gets even stranger, because for all these ingenious little sleeping arrangements, there are still creatures in the ocean that seem to ignore the whole idea of bedtime almost entirely, or at least make it so hard to recognise that for a long time people were not even sure what counted as sleep at all, which means the next part has to deal with the residents of the sea that look as though they never truly stop, never fully settle, or never learned what a proper night off was supposed to look like. By the time you have seen reef fish tuck themselves into coral, parrotfish wrap themselves in mucus, turtles wedge beneath ledges, and dolphins divide sleep across the brain, it is tempting to think the ocean's rest problem has more or less been solved. Strange, yes. Different from us, certainly, but still recognisable. You rest somehow, somewhere, and then carry on. And then the sea introduces you to another category entirely. The creatures that seem not to sleep at all, or at least refuse to do it in any way that makes immediate sense to a human observer. They keep moving, they remain exposed, they drift without obvious pause, they pulse, cruise, hover, migrate, or cycle through behaviour so subtle that for a long time people genuinely were not sure whether sleep was even happening. This is where the subject becomes especially good at humbling us, because much of what looks like sleeplessness in the ocean is really a failure of human expectations. We are very attached to visible signs. We want closed eyes, reduced posture, safe little corners, perhaps a faintly persuasive yawn. We want the body to tell us clearly that rest has begun. But the ocean is under no obligation to stage bedtime in a way that we can read from a comfortable distance. A creature may be resting while swimming slowly. It may be less responsive while still pulsing through the water. It may be following an internal rhythm that does not resemble our neat day-night cycle. It may possess such a different nervous system that asking whether it sleeps in our sense is already the wrong starting point. That is why this part of the story has to begin with caution. Never seem to sleep and never sleep are not the same claim. Marine biology is full of animals that once looked as though they were permanently active until closer study revealed quieter patterns, hidden rest states, or body-level compromises that are easy to miss if you're only watching for a mammalian style of shutdown. So the interesting question is not simply which creatures appear always awake. It is what appearance means in a place where movement, drifting, ventilation, and low-level responsiveness may continue even during rest. Sharks are one of the most famous examples, partly because they already come with a great deal of mythology attached. People like a shark to be dramatic. They like it streamlined, relentless, always moving, the sort of animal that would probably judge your swimming technique even while passing at speed. And because some sharks do indeed need ongoing movement, or at least cannot rest in the same way many fish do, the idea took hold that sharks do not sleep. Full stop. No bedtime, no quiet hours, just eternal, unsettling motion. It is a compelling image. It is also too simple. Some sharks can rest on the seafloor or in caves, especially species that can pump water across their gills while relatively still. Nurse sharks are a classic example. They can gather in resting spots and remain largely motionless, which is about as clear a sign of downtime as anyone could reasonably ask for from a shark. Other species, however, especially those built for open water cruising, do not have that same option. They may need to keep moving in order to maintain proper water flow or body control. For those animals, rest becomes much harder for us to recognise. It may involve slower swimming, reduced responsiveness, altered patterns of activity, and long periods that are quieter without being fully still. From the outside, that can look like a creature that never stops. From the inside, biologically speaking, it may be getting the closest thing its body can afford to a pause, and that is one of the most important distinctions in the whole subject. Continuous movement does not automatically mean continuous full wakefulness. A body can reduce activity and alter brain function without turning into a floating statue. This matters not only for sharks, but for other highly active open ocean species such as tuna. Tuna are built like they were designed by someone who considered constant forward motion a moral principle. Their bodies are streamlined, muscular, and exceptionally good at sustained swimming. They are not reef fish that can simply slot themselves into coral for the night. If they rested in a way that involved total stillness, it would conflict with the very design that makes them successful. So rest, when it occurs, is likely tied to reduced but continued motion, changes in pace, and patterns that are more subtle than a land animal's obvious sleep posture. There is something interesting in the way humans respond to animals like that. We often describe them as tireless, which is flattering but biologically sloppy. Tireless is mostly a word people use when they are not the ones doing the work. No animal is outside the basic problem of energy and recovery. If a creature seems endlessly active, the more useful assumption is not that it has somehow abolished the need for rest, but that its rest has been folded into movement so neatly that we struggle to see it. That is very different from not sleeping at all. Even so, the ocean does contain creatures that push the question much further. Jellyfish are a perfect example, because for a long time they sat awkwardly outside the human idea of sleep. They do not have a centralized brain like ours. They do not have eyelids, clear facial expressions, or a style of stillness that looks like conventional slumber. They pulse, they drift, they respond to the environment through a distributed nerve net and related structures that make them less like a fish, with peculiar manners and more like an entirely different proposal for how an animal might be built. For years, that made people less likely to ask whether jellyfish slept in any meaningful sense. What would sleep even mean for a body like that? Then researchers started looking more carefully, and as so often happens in biology, the animal responded by quietly embarrassing our assumptions. Some jellyfish have been observed showing periods of decreased activity, especially at night. They pulse less often. They are slower to respond to stimulation. If disturbed repeatedly, they may later show something like rebound, suggesting the quieter state serves a needed function, rather than being random laziness. That finding matters for two reasons. First, It suggests that sleep-like states may exist in animals with nervous systems far simpler than ours. Second, it means one of the creatures that seemed most purely wakeful from a human perspective was never actually giving us the full picture. It was resting, just not in a way that looked familiar. There is a pleasing irony in that. A jellyfish, which many people are inclined to treat as little more than decorative hazard with tentacles, turns out to offer one of the most important clues in the whole conversation. Sleep or sleep-like rest may not require a brain arranged anything like a mammal's. The basic need may be older, broader, and more deeply rooted in animal life than we once thought. Which is frankly rude of the jellyfish in the best possible way. Just when you think you are narrowing the definition, something translucent and brain-like wanders by and broadens it again. The same kind of problem appears in other drifting or weakly swimming animals. If an animal spends much of its life suspended in the water column, responding gradually, pulsing or filtering or drifting with occasional adjustments, how do you tell the difference between ordinary low-energy existence and true rest? It is not always easy. Researchers have to look for regular timing, reduced responsiveness, compensatory rebound after deprivation, and shifts in neural or behavioural patterns where possible. Without that, it is dangerously easy to mistake a subtle rest state for constant wakefulness. In the ocean, low drama often hides important biology. Planktonic life complicates matters even further. Now, strictly speaking, plankton are not one kind of creature. They are a whole collection of organisms that drift with currents, including tiny animals, larvae, protists, and more. Some move actively within limits. Some mostly go where the water takes them. Many follow daily vertical migrations, rising towards surface waters at night and descending during the day. That movement is often about feeding and predator avoidance, but it also reminds us that marine life may organise active and inactive periods around factors very different from human routine. For a tiny drifting creature, rest may not look like stopping. Stopping is already most of the lifestyle. Rest may instead involve metabolic reduction, altered responsiveness, or a different layer of the water column where the risks and demands change. This is one reason deep-sea animals can seem especially sleepless to us. Down there, the familiar cues are weak or absent. There is no obvious sunrise for many of them. Darkness is constant. Food can be scarce. Movement may need to be opportunistic rather than scheduled by a neat clock. In those conditions, activity may be spread out differently, and rest may be harder for us to detect. A deep-sea predator drifting almost motionless may be waiting, conserving energy, or resting. A gelatinous animal pulsing at long intervals may be active enough for its needs, and also in a low-demand state that performs some of the same functions sleep does elsewhere. Without clear visual drama, we are left doing what science often has to do, which is looking past intuition and gathering actual evidence. Coral, interestingly enough, offers another version of this problem. Coral colonies are made up of tiny polyps, and they do not sleep in a human sense, of course, but they do show rhythmic behaviour. Polyps may extend feeding tentacles more at certain times and retract at others. Activity cycles can track light, feeding, and internal clocks. That is not the same as saying corals sleep, but it is a reminder that living systems often shift between active and quiet states in patterned ways. The closer you look, the harder it becomes to draw a hard line between obvious sleep and the broader biological principle of alternating demand and recovery. Filter feeders more generally can give the impression of never sleeping because their activity is so continuous and understated. A sponge filtering water does not exactly tuck in for the night. A bivalve opening and closing its shell, a sea squirt processing passing water. These are not creatures that stage a recognisable bedtime scene. Yet even here, activity can vary in rhythms, responsiveness can change, and metabolic states can shift. The ocean is full of bodies that are doing less than they appear to be doing, and also more. That sounds contradictory, but it is mostly a problem of scale. When the behaviour is small and the body simple, our instincts become less useful. Some fish earn a reputation for not sleeping simply because they remain in open water, where resting spots are scarce. Pelagic species often cannot disappear into a reef crevice or settle beneath a ledge. Their world is more exposed, their motion more continuous, and their daily patterns harder for us to read. A school of fish moving slowly at night may not look asleep. It may just look less committed than it did at noon. But reduced schooling tightness, slower swimming, altered responsiveness, and lower activity can all indicate a form of rest. Again, the absence of theatrical stillness tells you very little on its own. Then, there are the species whose life cycle itself scrambles the question. Some animals rest intensely during one stage and barely at all during another. Migratory phases, spawning periods, reproductive guarding, or early parental care can temporarily cut down visible rest to astonishing levels. Certain fish guard eggs. Some marine mammals remain highly active after birth. Some crustaceans time behaviour around molting or breeding. If you watch them during that window, they may appear sleepless when in fact you're looking at a very specific season of their life, rather than their general rule. Humans do this too, of course. Observe anyone around a deadline, a newborn, or an overnight airport connection, and you may falsely conclude the species has given up sleep entirely. What makes the sea especially good at producing these false impressions is that it rewards background activity. Motion can be life support. Drifting can be a feeding method. Pulsing can be minimal transport. Holding position can require constant tiny adjustments. An animal that appears awake may simply be continuing the baseline behaviours its body cannot stop. That means the true signs of rest often live elsewhere, in reduced reaction time, changed timing, altered neural activity, lower metabolic output, or compensatory recovery later. The ocean keeps teaching the same lesson. If you only trust appearances, you will miss half of what is going on. This is also why the language around sleep can become slippery. Scientists often use phrases like sleep-like state or quiescence when they are dealing with animals whose biology makes direct comparison difficult. That is not evasive wording, it is careful wording. Calling something sleep implies a cluster of functions and features. Sometimes the animal clearly fits enough of them, sometimes it only overlaps partially. The deeper you go into marine life, the more you realise that the need for periods of reduced activity may be widespread, but the exact architecture of those periods is not uniform. Some creatures seem to rest in fragments, some in shifts, some in deeply patterned cycles, some in ways that look almost invisible unless you know exactly what to test. There is a useful human comparison here, though it should be used lightly. Think about how different human tiredness can look from one situation to another. Someone asleep in bed is obvious. Someone exhausted but still pacing an airport terminal. Someone on a long drive blinking too slowly. Someone quietly staring out of a train window while their brain does half the work it did an hour ago. Those are all different visible versions of reduced alertness. Now imagine trying to assess that from outside the species, through glass, underwater, in low light, with no shared facial language and a nervous system designed nothing like your own. It becomes obvious why the ocean produced so many myths about permanent wakefulness. And myths do persist, partly because they are satisfying. "This creature never sleeps" is a strong sentence. It sounds tough, it sounds alien, it sounds like the sea. But biology tends to prefer messier truths. More often than not, the creature in question does rest, only differently. Or it enters periods that serve some of sleep's functions without matching the whole package we expect. Or it becomes less active on a schedule that we failed to notice because we were watching at the wrong time. The genuine surprise is usually not that the animal has conquered sleep. It is that it has modified sleep so effectively that we almost mistook it for constant life. Still, one should not pretend all the mystery is gone. There are marine animals for which sleep remains difficult to define with confidence. The deeper ocean still hides more than we know. Some species are hard to observe long enough in natural conditions. Others behave differently in tanks than in the wild. Neural data are easier to get from some animals than others, so there are real limits here. But uncertainty is part of what makes the topic good. The sea is not simply giving us tidy answers in exotic packaging. It is showing us that even a basic need like rest can become hard to recognise when evolution has been allowed to improvise long enough. There is also something revealing in the fact that the creatures which seem most sleepless are often the ones most unlike us in body plan, habitat, or visible behaviour. That says as much about human perception as it does about the animals themselves. We are good at seeing ourselves in seals, otters, and dolphins because the echoes are obvious. We are worse at recognising rest in jellyfish, planktonic drifters, or open water swimmers because the similarities are buried under very different machinery. But life is not obligated to perform its needs in mammalian language. Recovery can happen in a nervous system without a central brain, in a body that continues pulsing, in a fish that never quite parks, in a drifting form that looks barely animate even when fully active. So when people say some ocean creatures never seem to sleep, the important word is not never, it is seem. They seem sleepless because the sea has hidden sleep inside motion, inside low responsiveness, inside rhythm, inside simple bodies and strange lives. Sometimes that hiddenness is only a matter of perspective. Sometimes it reflects a genuinely unfamiliar biological solution. Either way, the lesson is the same. In the ocean, rest can be so subtle that it disappears into behaviour we would otherwise call ordinary. And once you begin to accept that, another question naturally comes forward. Because if some marine creatures rest in ways that are hard to see, then the next thing to ask is what tells them when to do it at all, especially in a world where sunlight fades with depth. Day and night mean different things in different places, and the body's internal schedule has to make sense of currents, moonlight, darkness, tides, and pressure, which means the next step is not just about whether they sleep, but about how the sea itself reshapes the clock they are sleeping by. On land, most of us grow up with a fairly simple idea of what sets the day. The sun comes up, the world gets busy, the sun goes down and bodies begin winding towards sleep, even if modern life then barges in with lamps, screens, deadlines, and the occasional terrible decision to start a long film at a time when nobody involved is being reasonable. But even with all that, the basic structure still feels familiar. Light says morning. Darkness says night. The body clock listens, more or less. In the ocean, that arrangement does not disappear, but it gets bent into new shapes almost immediately. Light behaves differently in water. Depth changes everything. Currents move habitats under the animal rather than the other way around. Tides create cycles that have nothing to do with a neat human workday. And in some parts of the sea, moonlight matters so much that it can rearrange whole migrations. So when we ask why ocean creatures do not sleep like we do, one major part of the answer is that they are not sleeping inside the same timekeeping system at all. Their clocks are being set by a world where day and night are only the beginning of the schedule. Light is the obvious place to start, because in the sea, light is never just on or off. It weakens with depth, changes in colour, and gets filtered into something very different from the sunlight we know on land. NOAA notes that sunlight rarely penetrates beyond about 200 metres. The upper sunlit or euphotic zone, and the annual review on marine rhythms points out that light penetration helps define marine habitats in the first place. Water depth and even distance from the coast influence not only how much light is available, but also its spectral quality, which means the body clock of a marine animal is not responding to a simple day outside signal. It is responding to a layered, filtered version of day that depends on where in the water column it lives. Near the surface, dawn and dusk can be strong organising cues. Deeper down, those cues weaken, flatten, or vanish entirely. By the time you get into the deep ocean, sunlight is no longer a practical part of daily life at all, which means the usual land-based timing system has already been rewritten before the animal has even started solving the problem of sleep. That is why a reef fish and a deep-sea animal are not just living in different addresses, they are living under different calendars. A fish on a shallow coral reef experiences a very strong transition at dusk. Colours fade, shadows deepen. day-active neighbours begin retreating. Night-active hunters begin moving. The fish's behaviour can shift quickly because the light cue is clear. But an animal living far deeper may receive only a dim hint of those daily changes, or none at all. There, the body may rely more heavily on internal timing, on food availability, or on other regular signals in the environment. The annual review makes this point clearly by noting that marine habitats offer a rhythmic framework unlike anything on land, including not just light, but salinity, mechanical forces, and pressure changes. In other words, the ocean does not remove timekeeping. It adds more clocks to the room and lets them all start talking at once. A good way to see how strongly marine life can respond to light is to look at what happens when the normal light schedule is briefly faked. Solar eclipses are very useful for that. Smithsonian reports that during the 1998 total solar eclipse in the Galapagos, diurnal fish rapidly adopted nighttime behaviour when light intensity dropped, while nocturnal fish gradually emerged from their daytime cover. In later eclipse observations, zooplankton also moved upward in the water column as though dusk had arrived, then returned downward once the light came back. That is a wonderfully direct result. It tells us that for many marine animals, reduced light is not just a pretty atmospheric change, it is an instruction. It can send fish towards shelter, bring night feeders out, and trigger the huge daily movement of tiny animals that treat darkness as safe cover. Humans witnessing an eclipse usually just look up and try not to say anything foolish. A great many marine animals, by contrast, take it as a scheduling update. That huge daily movement has a name, and it may be one of the clearest examples anywhere in nature of how light rewrites marine timing. It is called diel vertical migration, or DVM. NOAA describes it as the greatest migration on Earth, involving billions upon billions of animals, mostly zooplankton and other small marine creatures, moving up and down through the water column every day. They rise towards surface waters at night to feed when the darkness hides them from visual predators, then descend again before sunrise. The annual review adds that such vertical migrations can span several hundred meters in a single day and are likely under circadian clock control, though they are also shaped by changing environmental conditions as the animals move between habitats. That means the body clock is not merely saying night now, day now. It is helping coordinate an entire elevator schedule through a three-dimensional world. It is also doing so in an environment where the meaning of up and down is tied to danger, temperature, light, food, and in some cases even ultraviolet damage. For a zooplankton animal, bedtime is not a room, it is a depth choice. And because the ocean enjoys making one good idea more complicated, light does not stop mattering when the sun goes away for long stretches. In the Arctic winter, where solar illumination can disappear for extended periods, researchers found that moonlight can drive vertical migrations across fjords, shelves, slopes, and the open sea. The current biology study found that in winter, zooplankton shifted from solar day timing to lunar day timing, with migrations following a 24.8-hour lunar cycle and broader monthly patterns linked to the moon as well. That is one of those results that sounds like a writer pushed too hard for atmosphere, except it is real and extremely helpful for understanding marine timing. When sunlight drops out, some animals do not stop reading the sky. They simply switch to a fainter clock. A full moon in that world is not background decoration. It can change where millions of animals place themselves in the water. It can also change when they are more exposed to predators, when they feed, and when their quieter periods are likely to happen. So even in darkness, the ocean does not become timeless. It just hands the schedule over to a dimmer manager. Depth then complicates all of this again, because a change in depth is not only a change in brightness, it is also often a change in temperature, pressure, and water movement. The annual review notes that the exact depth at which temperature changes rhythmically depends on currents and mixing, and can even vary from day to day. That means a marine animal moving vertically is not just passing through lighter and darker water, it is moving between physical environments that can alter metabolism, energy use, and behaviour. Deeper water is often colder. Colder water can reduce metabolic demand. Surface waters may be richer in food but more dangerous in daylight. So when marine animals organise their daily or nightly quiet periods, they're doing it in an environment where time of day and part of the water column are tightly linked. For us, bedtime might mean turning down the lights. For them, it may mean dropping 50, 100 or several hundred metres into a very different physical world. Currents deserve just as much credit as light and depth, because the ocean is not only layered vertically, it is moving laterally, surging, mixing and dragging whole habitats through repeating conditions. In coastal and intertidal environments, tides bring a cycle of roughly 12.4 hours, and the annual review points out that these tidal changes create major regular shifts in immersion, temperature, salt concentration, oxygen, and food availability. In those settings, a plain old 24-hour clock is not enough. Many marine organisms show circadian rhythms instead, or in addition, meaning their bodies anticipate the next high or low tide rather than merely the next sunrise. That is a profound difference from land life. Imagine trying to organise your sleep around a world that floods, drains, cools, warms, oxygenates and changes food access twice a day with the punctuality of the moon. Coastal marine animals do not need imagination for that. They're already living it. And this is not just a loose behavioural tendency. Marine timing systems can genuinely split between daily and tidal control. The annual review describes oyster valve opening rhythms that shifted from mostly circadian, around 24 hours, to circadian, around 12.4 hours, under constant darkness, which suggests both environmental control and an internal tidal oscillator. The review also notes that different species, including crustaceans, fish, sea anemones, limpets, and other marine organisms, show circadian locomotor or activity rhythms. In some cases, circadian and circadian rhythms appear partly dissociated from one another. That is a wonderfully untidy result, and exactly what the ocean would produce. Instead of one master clock with a single opinion, some marine animals appear to carry overlapping timing systems, each useful for a different recurring part of the environment. So the body is not only asking, is it day or night? It may also be asking, is the tide coming in? Is the current about to shift? Is this one of the hours when the water level changes everything? That is a far more demanding calendar than the one most humans complain about on a Monday. There is also a useful distinction here between animals that run strongly on internal clocks and animals that rely more heavily on outside cues. Smithsonian's discussion of eclipse responses puts this neatly by contrasting endogenous timing, driven more from within, with exogenous timing, driven more by external cues like sunlight. Fish that rapidly flip their behaviour during a sudden daytime darkening appear to be strongly light-dependent in that moment. Zooplankton rising during eclipses show the same thing. By contrast, some rhythms persist even under controlled conditions that remove the normal environmental signal, which points to a stronger internal oscillator. The ocean seems full of this mixed arrangement. Animals may have internal clocks, but those clocks are often being nudged, reset, sharpened, or overruled by real-time environmental changes. It is less like a wristwatch, and more like a wristwatch that keeps checking the weather, the tide table, the moon phase, and whether the local predators have changed shift. One of the most interesting consequences of all this is that marine rest does not always line up with darkness in a simple way. A shallow reef fish may indeed settle down at dusk because the light cue is strong and the habitat is structured around that daily turn, but an intertidal animal may be timing its quieter periods around the tide instead. A zooplankton animal may be more concerned with whether it is safe to approach surface waters than with whether a human would call it bedtime. A polar species may be responding to moonlight in a season when sunlight is scarce, and a deep-sea creature may be tuned to the movements of prey, water masses, or internal cycles that make very little intuitive sense to us from shore. So when we picture an ocean animal going to rest, we should stop imagining one universal marine evening. The sea does not really do one universal anything. It offers layered clocks, and each species listens to the ones that matter most for staying alive. There is something quite revealing in that. Humans like the comfort of one clean rhythm, even if we then spend a fair amount of our lives ignoring it for poor reasons. The ocean prefers a more complicated arrangement. Light matters, but its meaning changes with depth. Darkness matters, but moonlight can still rewrite behaviour. The day matters, but tides may matter just as much. Currents matter, temperature matters, food movement matters, and the body has to make sense of all of it without getting too tired, too exposed, or too out of sync with the world around it. That is why marine sleep can look so flexible. The clock itself is flexible, or rather there are several clocks, and the body is trying to stay on speaking terms with all of them. This is also why so many marine animals appear exquisitely timed. Reef fish retreat at the right moment. Zooplankton rise and sink with astonishing regularity. Intertidal animals anticipate environmental shifts rather than merely reacting after the fact. Corals and other marine organisms can coordinate behaviour using daily, monthly and seasonal cues. The annual review even points to the complexity of superimposed solar and lunar light cycles, and to the precise synchronization seen in coral reproductive timing, which likely depends on combined diel, monthly, and annual signals. That degree of timing precision is not decorative. In the ocean, being a little early or a little late can mean feeding at the wrong moment, resting in the wrong place, or becoming available to the wrong predator. Sleep, in other words, is never just about being tired. It is about matching the right quiet state to the right environmental window. And once you see the clock that way, as something rewritten by light, depth, tides, currents, and even moonlight, another truth becomes harder to ignore. All of those signals matter so much because they are tied directly to risk. Darkness may let you feed, but also expose you to a different hunter. Depth may hide you from one predator and place you nearer another. Tides may open feeding grounds and remove shelter in the same breath. The body clock in the ocean is not only a schedule for rest, it is a schedule for avoiding disaster, which means the next part of the story is not really about timekeeping anymore. It is about what all that timing is trying so hard to manage, because under the water, going quiet is never just a matter of being sleepy. It is the dangerous art of resting in a place where something else may already be awake. The hardest part about resting in the sea is not the tiredness, it is the risk. On land, sleep is already a vulnerable act. In the ocean, that vulnerability is sharper because the world around you does not pause politely while you become less responsive. Water keeps moving, light keeps changing. The distance between shelter and exposure can be very small, and there is always the basic problem that one creature's quiet hour may line up perfectly with another creature's dinner plans. That is why marine rest so often looks cautious, partial, hidden or brief. It is not that ocean animals fail to invent proper sleep. It is that the price of a bad sleeping decision underwater can be extremely high. A coral reef makes this especially obvious. By day it can look crowded and noisy in the way only a healthy reef can. Small fish move between coral heads, herbivores graze, cleaners work, predators patrol, and everyone seems to have somewhere to be. Then the sun drops, and the neighbourhood does not become peaceful so much as it changes personnel. Smithsonian notes that many ocean behaviours are synchronised to the daily cycle of light and dark, and under cover of darkness many animals begin feeding or moving in ways that would be too dangerous in daylight. So when a day-active reef fish settles down at night, it is not doing so in an empty world. It is doing so just as a different group of hunters, scavengers and nighttime foragers begins clocking in. That is why small prey fish care so much about structure. A crevice in a reef is not just a convenient place to hide, it is a survival tool. Research in scientific reports found that structural complexity on reefs changes visual exposure and the number of crevices available, and that these features provide both reduced visibility to predators and immediate physical refuge from attack. In plain terms, a fish resting near or inside the right bit of coral is not merely lying low. It is using architecture to lower the odds that something larger gets a clean view, a clean line of approach, or enough confidence to try its luck. That is the underwater equivalent of choosing a hotel room with a lock that actually works and a hallway that does not feel experimental. NOAA's Fish Sleep Overview makes the same point in a simpler way. Most fish do not sleep as land mammals do, but many reduce activity and metabolism while still remaining alert to danger. Some float in place, some wedge themselves into mud or coral, some find or build secure spots. That alertness matters because resting fish do not have the luxury of becoming entirely unavailable to the world. Their quiet state has to leave enough room for a fast exit if a predator appears, or at the very least enough awareness that the body can shift from rest to panic without too much ceremony. In marine terms, a good night's sleep is often less about deep surrender and more about a careful reduction in activity that still leaves the emergency exits mentally lit. For prey animals in open water, the problem becomes even more severe because there may be no convenient reef hole, no ledge, and no sand patch to dive into. That is where timing takes over. The massive daily up and down movement known as diel vertical migration is one of the clearest predator-prey compromises in the ocean. Smithsonian describes how fishes, squid, shrimp, and zooplankton rise toward the surface at night under the protection of darkness, then retreat into deeper darkness by day, when visual predators can see them more easily. The Current Biology review on diel vertical migration sums up the underlying trade-off with the phrase, better unfed than dead. That is about feeding rather than sleep in the strictest sense, but the logic is the same. Marine animals often choose safety first and then fit rest, feeding, and movement around whatever level of danger the light allows. The annual review on marine rhythms adds another layer to this by showing that these daily movements are tied not only to light, but to internal timing systems and other environmental cues. Many marine animals are not just reacting blindly when conditions shift. Their bodies are anticipating changes in risk. That means rest is rarely a simple response to feeling tired. It is part of a schedule built around where predators can see, where prey can hide, and when the physical environment offers the best bargain between getting necessary recovery and not getting removed from the food web entirely. In the ocean, even stillness often has a timetable attached to it, and that timetable is written partly by whoever is doing the hunting nearby. Darkness, of course, is not automatically friendly. It helps prey hide from one set of hunters, but it also gives another set of hunters their advantage. Smithsonian's overview of the ocean at night makes this very clear. Some creatures depend on the darkness as cover from predators, while others use the nighttime window for behaviours that are important to survival, including predation itself. So if you are a day-active fish trying to rest, night is not a universal safety zone. It is only safer relative to daylight in certain ways. Visual predators may lose some edge, but nocturnal hunters gain theirs. The result is that many reef fish spend the night hidden, buried, wedged, or chemically disguised. They are not simply sleeping because it is dark. They are sleeping in the specific way that gives them the best chance of not being found by the animals that prefer working the late shift. That chemical disguise can get surprisingly literal. The well-known case is the parrotfish mucus cocoon. The peer-reviewed study in Biology Letters found that coral reef parrotfish remaining inside a mucus cocoon at night were much less likely to be attacked by gnatheid isopods, which are blood-feeding parasites that regularly attack fish at night. In other words, the cocoon is not a decorative bedtime flourish. It is part parasite net, part concealment tactic, and part nighttime insurance policy. There is something wonderfully practical about that. If darkness increases the chance that something will find you by scent or by close contact, then adding a barrier that reduces those attacks is a good investment. Humans buy blackout curtains. Parrotfish secrete their own strange little privacy system and get on with it. Even sand can become part of this same defensive logic. NOAA notes that species such as Pacific sand lance burrow into sand to rest, conserve energy, and avoid predation. That is the key phrase: avoid predation. Sand is not just soft enough to disappear into, it lowers visual exposure, breaks up outline, and makes a resting fish much harder to detect quickly. The dangerous art of resting in the sea is full of these tiny adjustments. A fish may choose coral rather than open water, sand rather than hovering, mucus rather than exposure, because each one trims the predator's odds a little further. No single method guarantees safety, but marine life is very good at building survival out of small percentage improvements. Predators, meanwhile, are dealing with their own version of the same problem. A predator also needs rest. A shark, a large fish, or a marine mammal cannot hunt continuously without cost, but predators are vulnerable while resting too. Noah Fisheries explains that whales and dolphins sleep in a way very different from most mammals, maintaining the ability to swim, breathe, and remain aware because they sleep with one hemisphere of the brain at a time. The Peerless study on dolphin vigilance makes the practical point even more bluntly. If dolphins slept like terrestrial animals, they might drown, and if they failed to maintain vigilance, they would become susceptible to predation. That sentence does a nice job of ruining any romantic idea that the ocean is an easy place to relax just because you happen to sit higher on the food chain. Even successful predators cannot afford much carelessness when they are resting in water. There is a useful symmetry in that. Prey species hide because predators are active. Predators remain partly alert because other risks remain active too. The whole ocean is running on these overlapping levels of caution. A reef fish uses crevices because it fears the hunter. A dolphin uses unihemispheric sleep because full unawareness would be dangerous. A vertical migrator rises only when darkness offers enough cover and drops again when light returns. Everyone is making calculations, not consciously in the human sense, but through bodies and behaviours shaped by the same basic truth. Rest is necessary, but so is not being an easy target. Those two facts push against each other all night long. This is one reason habitat quality matters so much. If a reef has plenty of crevices, branching corals, enclosed spaces, and visually sheltered areas, then small fish and other prey animals have better options for low-risk rest. The scientific reports paper makes clear that structural complexity offers both reduced visual exposure and physical refuges from predators, and that these traits help explain where certain fish species are found. Remove those structures, flatten the reef, simplify the terrain, and you do not just make the place less scenic, you make it harder for animals to disappear when they need to. A simplified reef is not merely an ecological problem during feeding and breeding hours, it is also a much worse sleeping environment. Light pollution shows the same principle from the other side. Smithsonian notes that many marine behaviours regulated by darkness are being disrupted by artificial light. If darkness is part of what gives prey species cover and helps them choose safe resting periods, then extra light can expose them at the wrong time, shift predator-prey interactions, and alter the ordinary rhythm of who gets to rest when. Even without turning this into a whole lecture on coastal development, the point is simple. The marine night is not empty time, it is a carefully used resource. When darkness is changed, rest and danger are changed with it. The same goes for the open ocean, where the danger is not a group appearing into coral, but the constant problem of spatial overlap. The PubMed abstract on reverse deal vertical migration describes a copepod population reducing overlap with nocturnal invertebrate predators, and suggests that even a modest reduction in mortality can offset the costs of migrating across a thermal gradient each day. That is an excellent illustration of how valuable predator avoidance is in marine timing. Animals will accept energetic costs, temperature shifts, and long daily movement if doing so lowers the chance of being eaten. Resting periods fit into that same logic. A quieter state is worth having only if the animal can place it where mortality risk stays acceptable. This also helps explain why marine rest often looks fragmented or oddly placed to us. We are used to sleeping in one consolidated block because our environments, at least ideally, allow it. Many ocean creatures cannot afford that sort of confidence. Their rest may come in shorter bouts, in protected locations, in lowered responsiveness that never becomes total, or in partial neurological shutdown rather than complete disengagement. If the night is full of predators, parasites, moving water, and changing light, then rest has to remain flexible. The body cannot insist on one perfect setup. It has to take what the environment allows and still get enough recovery to function tomorrow. That may not look luxurious, but marine life is not aiming for luxury. It is aiming for adequate repair under hostile conditions, and really, that is the central trick of it. Resting in the sea is not one behaviour. It is a negotiation between fear and fatigue. Predators want enough quiet to recover for the next hunt. Prey want enough quiet to survive the next day. Darkness helps some and harms others. Habitat protects some and exposes others. Depth hides one body while bringing it closer to another threat. Every sleeping place, every reduced movement, every nighttime migration, every crevice chosen over open water is part of that negotiation. The ocean does not hand out safe nights in any generous way. It offers temporary windows, useful structures, and just enough opportunity for the animals that have learned how to use them. And once you see sleep in that light, not as a peaceful absence from danger, but as a managed truce with it, the final question becomes less about fish, or dolphins, or reefs in isolation, and more about what all of these strange arrangements say about rest itself, because by the time you have watched life make this many compromises just to go quiet for a while, you begin to understand that ocean sleep is not only different from ours, it reveals something bigger about what rest really is when survival keeps making the rules. By the time you have followed fish into coral cracks, watched parrotfish hide inside mucus cocoons, drifted alongside jellyfish that pulse more slowly at night, and spent time with dolphins that let one hemisphere of the brain sleep while the other keeps the body moving and breathing, one thing becomes hard to ignore. The ocean did not get rid of sleep. It forced life to renegotiate it. NOAA notes that most fish do rest, even though they do not sleep like land mammals, and NOAA Fisheries explains that dolphins and whales keep the ability to swim, breathe, and remain aware by sleeping with one brain hemisphere at a time. That combination says a great deal. Rest is necessary enough that evolution keeps finding ways to preserve it, even when the environment makes ordinary sleep awkward, risky, or impossible. That is probably the first big lesson. Rest is not a luxury feature added to easy lives. It is a basic requirement that remains in place even when conditions become inconvenient. The sea is inconvenient in ways land animals do not usually have to think about. It moves under you. It changes with depth. It can hide you or expose you depending on the hour. A body may need to stay buoyant, keep water moving over gills, surface for air, or remain alert to predators while still trying to recover, and yet the need for a quieter state remains. Fish reduce activity and metabolism. Dolphins divide sleep across the brain. Jellyfish enter a sleep-like state with slower pulsing and lower responsiveness. Different bodies solve the same problem by very different means. That matters because humans are often tempted to define biological things by how they look in us. We do it with intelligence, with emotion, with communication, and certainly with sleep. We imagine darkness, stillness, closed eyes, a safe place, a fairly dramatic drop in responsiveness, and ideally a mattress that is not somehow worse than the mattress you tried in a hotel once and still complain about. But the ocean keeps showing that the visible performance is not the essence. A fish without eyelids can still rest. A dolphin that keeps swimming can still rest. A jellyfish without a brain in the human sense can still enter a sleep-like state. Once you accept that, sleep starts to look less like one specific ritual and more like a family of biological strategies aimed at repair, regulation, and survival. It also reveals something useful about time. On land, most people think of the body clock as a conversation with daylight. That is true in the ocean too, but only up to a point. Marine rhythms are being shaped by much more than sunrise and sunset. The annual review of marine biological rhythms shows that ocean life is organised by daily, tidal, lunar and seasonal cycles, with environmental cues that include light, mechanical forces, salinity, temperature and pressure. Noah's explanation of Deal vertical migration adds another clear example. Billions of animals move up and down through the water column every day in one of the planet's largest migrations. So marine timekeeping is not one neat clock on the wall. It is several clocks talking over one another, with the body trying to stay aligned to the ones that matter most in its part of the sea. That makes ocean rest feel very different from human rest. We're used to asking, is it night yet? A great many marine animals are effectively asking a longer question. Is it dark enough to rise? Is it bright enough to hide? Is the tide turning? Is the current changing? Is moonlight going to expose me? Is this the hour when predators can see me best? Is this the hour when prey will be closest to the surface? The review of marine rhythms describes these overlapping oscillations very clearly, and Smithsonian's reporting on eclipse responses and nighttime ocean life shows how quickly marine animals respond to changes in darkness. For them, time is not an abstract schedule. It is a map of shifting risk, and that may be the second big lesson. Rest is not separate from danger. It is shaped by danger. On a coral reef, a good sleeping place is also a hiding place. In the open ocean, a good resting period is often one that overlaps with the lowest available exposure to predators. Smithsonian describes how darkness allows many ocean animals to move upward and feed under cover, while NOAA's fish sleep page notes that some fish wedge themselves into coral or mud, or even burrow into sand to rest and avoid predation. In other words, the quiet state itself is only half the story. The other half is where and when that quiet state becomes survivable. This is why ocean sleep tells us so much about life more generally. Life is not just a collection of abilities. It is a collection of compromises. A dolphin gains the advantages of mammalian intelligence and air breathing in the sea, but pays for that with the need to remain partly alert during rest. A reef fish gains the shelter of a complex habitat but depends on that structure to sleep safely. A parrotfish gains enough from its mucus cocoon that the effort of producing it is worthwhile, because it reduces attacks from blood-feeding parasites while the fish sleeps. No solution is free. Every resting method is tied to a body plan, an environment, and a set of trade-offs that had to become good enough to last. That word, good enough, is important. Humans often admire nature as though it were always aiming for elegance. Sometimes it is elegant. A dolphin sleeping with half a brain at a time is hard not to admire, but often nature is less elegant than practical. It does not ask, what's the most beautiful form of rest? It asks, what can this body afford without dying? That is how you get sand-burrowing fish, bottom-resting sharks, surface-sleeping otters wrapped in kelp, and jellyfish whose sleep-like state only became obvious when scientists measured changes in pulsing and responsiveness. The goal is not a perfect night's sleep. The goal is a workable one. And oddly enough, there is something reassuring in that. Not because human life should suddenly start aspiring to mucus cocoons or sleeping with one eye open, though some people's weeks already feel alarmingly close to the second one. It is reassuring because it shows that rest is flexible. Life protects it even when it cannot protect the familiar form of it. That is a profound thing. If one version of recovery becomes unsafe, the body does not necessarily give up. It trims, divides, hides, anchors, schedules, and improvises. It finds another route. The ocean is full of bodies doing exactly that. Ocean sleep also says something useful about vulnerability. Humans often treat vulnerability as failure. We want to be efficient, alert, available, always on, as though needing recovery were an embarrassing design flaw rather than the most ordinary thing in the world. Marine life makes that attitude look slightly ridiculous. Even sharks rest. Even whales rest. Even jellyfish, which seem to have solved life by becoming mostly umbrella and determination, enter quieter states. Rest is not weakness. It is maintenance. The fact that it must be protected so carefully in the sea only underlines how important it is. A need that shows up across such different bodies is not trivial. It is central. There is another point hiding in all this, and it has to do with attention. Humans are very good at noticing loud, dramatic, visible things. The ocean is full of important things that are none of those. A fish changing colour at dusk, a slower pulse in a jellyfish, a school shifting depth as light fades, a dolphin surfacing in a quieter rhythm, a reef fish returning night after night to the same crevice. These are not showy events, but they shape survival. Smithsonian's work on ocean night and NOAA's materials on fish sleep and vertical migration all point to the same broad truth. Much of marine life is governed by subtle transitions rather than dramatic switches. If you only look for spectacle, you miss the system. That may be why this subject lingers in the mind. It begins as a question about whether fish sleep, or whether whales do it strangely, or whether anything in the sea ever really gets to switch off. But the longer you stay with it, the more it becomes a question about how life handles limits. Water is a limit, predation is a limit, breathing is a limit, depth is a limit, darkness is a limit, and also sometimes the solution to another limit. Sleep in the ocean is what happens when necessary recovery passes through all of those filters and still somehow survives as a function. That is not only interesting, it is one of the clearest examples of evolution being both strict and inventive at the same time. It also changes how we think about time itself. In human life, time is often treated as a possession. We save time, waste time, run out of time, lose track of time, and then make ourselves more tired with the language of it. The ocean does not seem to think of time that way. Marine life behaves more as though time is a set of windows. Feed now, hide now, rise now, drop now, rest here, not there, rest tonight, but only if the moonlight is weak enough. Smithsonian's reports on marine responses to darkness and the annual review on rhythmic marine environments both support that broader picture. Time in the sea is less like a resource in your pocket and more like changing weather that the body learns to read. That perspective has a way of making human life look a bit over-designed. We build schedules, alarms, calendars, reminders, and wearable devices that tell us what time it is, how long we slept, and whether we have been irresponsible with caffeine again. Many marine creatures manage a far more complex environmental schedule without any of that, though admittedly with the help of millions of years of selection, and without the burden of email. Their clocks are biological, yes, but they are also relational. They make sense only in connection with light, tide, temperature, depth, and danger. In the sea, time is not just something passing. It is something the body must continuously negotiate. And maybe that is why the topic feels bigger than sleep by the end. Ocean rest is not only about what animals do at night. It is about how bodies live inside conditions they did not choose. It is about how necessary things are preserved when the easiest form of them is unavailable. It is about compromise without collapse. A dolphin does not stop needing sleep because it must surface for air. A fish does not stop needing safety because the reef becomes dangerous after dark. A jellyfish does not stop needing a quieter state because its nervous system is simple. The need remains, the form changes. That is a useful pattern to notice in biology, and not a bad one to notice elsewhere either. So if there is one final thing ocean sleep reveals, it may be this. Rest is not defined by how closely it resembles our version of lying still in the dark. Rest is defined by whether it allows life to continue well enough tomorrow. That is the standard nature seems to care about. Not neatness, not familiarity, not whether the method looks proper to a human observer, just whether the animal wakes, or rises, or surfaces, or pulses onward with enough energy and enough stability to keep being itself. In a sea full of motion, that is a remarkable achievement. And so, after all this, the ocean does not leave us with one tidy image of sleep. It leaves us with many. A fish in coral, a ray under sand, a parrotfish inside a mucus veil, a jellyfish pulsing more slowly in the dark, A dolphin gliding with one half of the brain asleep and one eye still open to the world. Different bodies, different clocks, different dangers, different answers, but the same underlying truth. Life needs a way to go quiet for a while, even in the sea, especially in the sea, and perhaps that is the most human thing we are allowed to recognise in it, not because the ocean creatures are secretly like us, but because all living things, however strange their shape or schedule, eventually arrive at the same basic requirement. There has to be some room, somewhere, for recovery.